At the Marquise's estate, a young lady read the document with a smile. She smiled and said that they would not have a big wedding and would live in the north. Gilbert wanted to warn her in advance that she would not have much time to relax in luxury. After all, she was supposed to be fulfilling the duties of a hostess, but he was taken aback and looked at her in bewilderment when she screamed. The young lady enjoyed the wonderful dessert with tenderness, despite everything. Gilbert looked at her with a cold grin and realized that it was not for nothing that they said she was the queen of social life. A few days ago, in the ballroom of the imperial palace, the crown princes smiled and said that he listened to her and beat her hair, although he knew that rumors cannot be fully trusted. But looking at her, he looked with a grin because she suited him perfectly. Mavia smiled and said that she agreed to the wedding. He looked at her with a fierce grin and said that it was a wise decision, since she would not have been able to refuse anyway because of the contract. Maevia looked at him with a smirk and asked who said that she would marry him. He was taken aback. The young man looked at his companion in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Mevia smiled and said that she was not marrying him. She looked at him with a smirk and said that she was marrying his father. A long time ago, about 300 years ago, their ancestors made a pact. They wanted to betroth their descendants, but they extended the period because they knew that the descendants could be of the same sex, or the age difference would be too big. It was just a joking promise of the old people, but the problem was in the paper on which the contract was written. Even if you burn this paper in lava or throw it into the deepest sea, she still returned back to her place. Gilbert was furious. He shouted that this was unacceptable. He shouted that near the rays of the breach of contract, misfortune would befall the family. The young lady looked closely at the paper. This initially too timid Mavia could not withstand Gilbert's pressure, and unfortunately, she would have agreed to the offer. But she was a lady from the modern world. Therefore, she already knew how this story would end. Gilbert, whose eldest son was installed as Grand Duke, but there was also a second son, Rihan, who was still alive. The boy had a kind heart and a talent for magic. He became the main character of this novel. But the envious Gilbert was overcome with feelings of inferiority, and so he became the main villain of the novel. But 1 year later, Gilbert took the daughter of a noble family as his wife. The unfortunate woman who became the villain's wife was Miva. Her family was on the verge of bankruptcy due to a series of bad investments, and she was unable to refuse Gilbert's threats. One day, while spending hellish days in the north, she began to think that perhaps it would have been better if she had not married. But this situation did not happen again, as the young lady who was reborn saved her family so much so that the rooms were filled with gold and silver. Gilbert was furious. He shouted and called for the young lady, as he did not understand what she was doing at all. He looked at her with fury and asked if he had done anything to upset her. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if something was wrong. She said with a smile that it was simple, and she was genuinely interested in his father, because he had raised such a wonderful man, and she would like to meet him. She said with a joyful smile that the most important thing was that his father was single, so it was with him that she should sign the contract. A moment later, she handed him the contract, telling him to look at one of the clauses, since there were no restrictions on age, social status, or other factors. He was shocked and wondered if there really was something like that. He knew that everyone in the empire knew that the Grand Duke was an old man. He asked in a hurry what she wanted, a dress, jewelry, or wealth, but she only looked at him with a smile. He shouted angrily and asked if she was behaving this way only because of his origin. A moment later, the young lady called her maid and told her to lead the young man. At the same time, she looked at him with a satisfied smile and called him son. Gilbert froze in shock, not expecting anything like this. At the same time, in the north at the Grand Duke's estate, peace and quiet reigned. The snake hurriedly crawled to its master and told him to wake up. She looked at him intently and asked how long he would sleep, but the Duke in turn did not answer and continued to sleep. The young lady knew that even the devil was better than Gilbert. Some time later, the man came to the young lady at the behest of Mr. Gilbert. A few days later, he also came to her to talk. The next time, he begged the young lady with tears in his eyes to meet their master. The last time he came, he sighed heavily because he knew that the meeting would not happen. At the same time, the young lady was sitting quietly in her room and enjoying her breakfast. At that very moment, the maid rushed in and called her in a hurry. She looked at Sarah in surprise and asked if something had happened. Sarah shouted that Mr. Gilbert had sent her a gift. She was furious because he sent morning chrysanthemums. Mavia said with bewilderment that perhaps he did not do it on purpose. She said the white color looked symbolic and nice, so he took them. But Sarah was furious. She screamed that in the Grand Duke's house, they didn't even teach basic norms and manners. The young lady decided not to listen to her maid and suggested that she go and spend some money. Sometime later, the young ladies came to the store, but it was closed for the whole day. The girls looked at the young lady with admiration and said that it was a great honor for them to serve her. The girl looked intently at the young ladies and said that they should call her at any time for them. Charlie thanked her friend with a smile, as Ta had invited her to the salon, and she had recently been wondering what to wear for Monica's birthday. Mavia looked at her friend with a smile and said that she was very grateful to everyone for agreeing to join her. Charlie sighed heavily and said that now she could calm down, because she would be able to choose a dress with hers. After all, the last time she came to meet her friend, she yelled at her because of her ridiculous outfit. Mavia looked at her friend and told her not to worry, as she would pick out a very sophisticated and cool outfit for her. Charlie happily rushed to hug her friend, as she was very grateful to her. Sometime later, the young lady came to the store, but she was told that she could not enter. She was shocked, so she made a scene. The young ladies were taken aback as they heard a familiar voice, but a few minutes later, she burst into the hall. They tried to stop her, but she said with a smile that everything was fine since her friends were there. She looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if she minded her coming. Mavia asked with a smile if something was wrong. A moment later, everyone greeted Monica. Monica frowned at Charlie and asked what she was doing there, since no matter how much she spent on the outfit, she had no sense of style. Charlie sighed heavily and said, "Young lady, that she asked for help with her choice today?" Monica froze for a moment. A moment later, Monica sat down next to the lines and said that since it was like that, she would help her with her choice. Charlie was taken aback and told her friend that she didn't have to do that. Monica asked in surprise if she really doubted her taste just now. Monica said Mavia was beautiful, so she would look good even in a wheat bear. But Charlie had better trust her taste. Mavia looked at the girl knowing that she had been described as a villain, but she was actually quite nice. A moment later, Monica said with a smile that she had found the outfit. She smiled and said that bright and feminine outfits would suit Charlie's dull look best. Charlie was taken aback because the outfit was too fancy and didn't suit her. Monica was in shock and shouted at the girl that she needed to try it on. Mavia looked closely at the young lady and asked if she would like to try on the outfit herself. Mavia said with a smile that she thought it would go well with her hair color. Monica said sheepishly that she didn't particularly like it, but if she insisted, she would try on the outfit. Everyone watched the training with a smile. Mavia smiled and told the young lady what outfit she would like her to try on. A few minutes later, Monica said that she had heard that Gilbert had proposed to her, and she hoped that she had turned him down. The young ladies began to whisper, because they knew that Gilbert was the very son of the Grand Duke. Mavia smiled and said that she declined the offer. Monica said that although Gilbert looked noble, he was an adopted son, and it was funny to watch him try to act like a real aristocrat. Charlie looked at Monica in surprise and said that it was too much of her. Monica shouted that their friend deserved better, because if she got married, she would have to go north. Mavia looked at her friend with a smile and told her that she didn't need to worry. As she left, she smiled and said that she would live there very happily in the cozy north, where her husband looked only at her. As she was leaving, she said she wasn't feeling well, so she would go first. She understood that in the end, everything was repeating itself again, because Monica in the original novel said unpleasant things about Gilbert every day. This slander began to be considered her words, and as soon as she accidentally nodded, everything ended in a beating. It turned out that this was not enough, because the young lady decided to climb into his bed. She knew perfectly well that it would have been better for her and her friend never to have met such a scumbag as him. She froze for a moment when she heard Gilbert's voice saying that she seemed to be feeling better already. He blocked her path with a grin and called out. She was surprised, as she did not expect to meet him. The young lady in turn froze for a moment in surprise. For some time, the young lady stared at the young man without answering. Gilbert looked at her with a smirk and asked if she had anything to say. She said that, unfortunately, she still had a high temperature and had not gotten any better, but if she didn't buy herself a new product, the illness would definitely get worse. At that very moment, the young man burst into wild laughter. She was surprised and wondered if he had gone crazy. Looking at the young lady, Gilbert said that he had not been perceptive enough. He asked with a smile if that was why she was behaving this way, because she wanted to see him suffer. With lightning speed, Gilbert grabbed her hand and told her that she must not go too far with her pathetic antics. He looked at her with cold fury and said that his patience was over. She was shocked because she realized that she had let her guard down, and he had already shown his true face. At that very moment, the girls ran out of the hall and shouted at the young man to stop. He said he came to talk to the lady who broke her promise. He smiled and asked the ladies if they could leave the place for a while. Charlie looked at the young man with fury and said that she would call security right away. He froze for a moment as he caught their gaze. The Duke looked at him with such a contemptuous look. The Duke angrily told him to leave and not to dare come to him with such nonsense. Gilbert was furious because they were still looking at him as if he were some kind of insect. He shouted that he would become the one who would rule the entire North. Mavia looked at the young man with cold fury and said that if he did not want to be arrested, he had better leave now. He was furious because he saw that a whole crowd of spectators had already gathered around them. Sarah, with the speed of lightning, shouted to her mistress not to climb into the carriage slowly. Charlie hurriedly pushed her friend into the carriage. Mavia turned around and thanked her friend for her concern. Gilbert in turn looked intently at the young lady and called her. He looked at her coldly and said that he would come for her on the day of the imperial ball. She asked with a smirk if she hadn't made herself clear enough. She said she wasn't going to take it to the ball, so they could make their next date her engagement party. Sometime after the young ladies had gone north, it became fashionable to politely decline an offer. Sometimes they would even burn flowers to show that someone didn't want to meet anymore. The young lady sighed heavily, as the day had been very busy. Sarah told the mistress that she should be more careful in the near future. Sarah looked at her mistress with a worried expression and said that she should drink some water first. Mavia sighed heavily, since she did not know how the master knew where she was. Sarat was trembling with fear, asked if he really had put a dash on her. Malvaya, looking at the maid, said that if it had been one of their people, they would have understood immediately. Sarah told the lady that next time, she should only go out with security. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so. It was just that Sarah looked at her in bewilderment, as she did not understand why. She said that, although Gilbert didn't look like it, he was considered the best swordsman in the entire empire. She knew that it was time for the guards to come, and they would hardly be able to stop him. Sarah was in shock, because she didn't know what they would do in such a case. Malvia said that everything would be fine, since they had it in case of emergency, and she would only use it once. She knew that after the wedding, the young man would not be able to look at her. A few seconds later, their conversation was interrupted, as they heard a terrible roar. At the same time, something was rushing from window to window. Sarah was shocked. She realized that this was an attack by a magical creature, so they needed to quickly call the knights. The young lady, in turn, told her maid not to invite anyone there. At that very moment, a small companion landed on her hand. She was surprised because she saw a raven, and at that very moment, she greeted him with a smile. Looking at the magical beast, she realized that it was the Duke's familiar. At the same time, the Duke looked in surprise at the documents that the young lady had sent him, because she intended to marry him. He looked closely at his familiar and called out to him, but a moment later, he released him and told him to fly and find out what Gilbert was up to. He also wanted to know this information about his fiancée, so he told his friend familiarly to keep an eye on her. She looked at the Duke's familiar with a smile, as she could not imagine that he had such a cute and magical creature. At the same time, the Duke's estate in the capital was in turmoil. Gilbert in turn smashed everything that came his way, as he was very angry with the young lady. He shouted angrily and asked if she knew what position he would occupy in the future. He shouted that in the future he would become the head of the house, and she in turn dared to reject him. At the same time, Raven the Watchful was watching the young man. The Duke was furious, as it was a complete horror, and he simply could not look at such a sight any longer. The young man entered the young master's room and informed him that he had brought what he had ordered. Gilbert rushed to his subordinate with lightning speed and told him to hand over the belly to him. He said with a fierce grin that everything would now be finished with the young lady. The Duke sighed heavily, as it was unpleasant for him to look at such a sight. The next day, the young lady woke up the sleepy bird. She smiled looking at the bird and said that it was time for her to get up. Raven slowly opened his eyes, but after a few minutes, he looked at the young lady with embarrassment. She looked at him with a smile and said that they needed to go somewhere. Looking at the little raven, she said that something interesting would happen soon. She had spent a lot of time preparing for such a day, and had studied the young man to the very core. Now she knew him better than he knew himself. She intended to use him and wanted him to wait for this moment, because she wanted to absorb everything, fate and all, in order to deal with him. Sarah looked at the lady with concern and asked if she was sure she could handle it. She smiled and told Sarah not to worry. She said with a smile that nothing terrible would happen, and that her faithful mare would not be harmed either. But still, the maid was very frightened, and wanted her mistress to take at least one night with her. Mavia told her maid that if a stranger appeared, the young man would be wary. She wanted to sort it out with him this time, and looking at the raven, she told him not to worry, as everything would be fine. She looked closely at the raven, and asked him not to follow her. A moment later, she rushed to meet her destiny. Mavia was walking on her horse when she became alert, because she heard some noise. After a few seconds, she was taken aback, and pulled her horse towards her, as she clearly saw a young man in front of her. She was shocked as he pointed his sword at her. Mavia asked with a smirk what he was doing anyway. Gilbert, still grinning, asked if she was surprised, since he only wanted to greet her. He said that she did not need to be on guard, but to look at him. She asked the young man to move out of the way. He looked at her with a smirk and said that she had excellent skills, and also asked where she took horse riding lessons. She was shocked and asked if he had really stopped her on the way just for such nonsense. Gilbert angrily said that she was as impatient as always. Gilbert looked at her sharply and said that he would get straight to the point and therefore give her a chance. She was shocked. He looked at her with a smirk and said that he would give her a chance to accept his proposal and go to the ball with him. He looked at her intently and said that the Duke would never take her as his wife. He said that people were just cattle to him. He bought them when he needed them and used them as tools, but now he had no use for Scott. He said that if the Duke allowed the marriage to take place, he would throw her into the bread and would not protect her from the wolves. Mavia asked with a smile if this was true. It seemed to her that he was much more merciful than the young man described him. She said that even though he lagged behind his younger brother, he did what he wanted. and only spoiled the reputation of their family. She smiled and said that there was not even the slightest attraction in him. Mavia said with a smirk that he still hasn't been eliminated. She smiled and said that she hoped he understood everything, and so she would go. Gilbert looked at her with fury, knowing she had just missed her last chance. He shouted that he would make her regret this for the rest of her life. He rushed towards her in rage because she dared to humiliate him. He shouted that in that case, he would cut off her legs so that she would not get any points. But a moment later, the young lady used her strength and easily flipped over on her horse. The young man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a sight. He froze for a moment in shock, still holding the sword in his hands. But at that very moment, the young lady struck him on the arm with the speed of lightning and thus knocked the sword out of his hand. She looked at him intently and said that she had answered him politely. A moment later, she looked at him with a fierce grin and asked if he had decided that she was afraid of him. Gilbert froze in shock as he couldn't understand how this was possible. Many years ago, a young lady accidentally met an old man on the road, and he told her that he must soon leave the world. She met the devil, who was hiding under the guise of an old man. He appeared to her and offered her a deal. It was a form of evil that was never mentioned in the novel, though her whole body was frozen with horror. She instinctively understood that she would die, and if she refused him, she screamed that she would make any grave for him. A moment later, he handed her his blood and told her to drink it whenever she needed strength. Although there were some side effects, she would be able to borrow his power for a while. She was a little puzzled, because the blood was very bitter, and she needed to drink it. He described it and said he would make it strawberry-flavored. Remembering her meeting with him, she realized that he was kind enough for the devil. At the same time, the young man shouted that she was just a witch. He shouted with rage and asked if she had made a contract with the devil. Maivia looked at him closely and said with a smile that it seemed so. He was furious and shouted that she was a vile coward, so he would return and report everything to the imperial family. She smiled and asked if he would report that a poor young lady had attacked him. She said that if he himself were the emperor, no one would believe that a weak lady had defeated him. He froze in place in shock, as he did not expect this. He did not understand why he felt a power from her similar to the power of his father. He was shocked because this power was more powerful than his. At the same time, the raven flew above them and showed his master everything that was happening. The Duke realized it was a trap, but looking at the young lady, he did not know what her calm expression meant. The Duke sighed heavily and wondered if she had predicted his every move. Cullen in turn found his friend furious and asked what he was doing. With lightning speed, he dismounted from his horse and greeted the young lady, introducing himself. He approached his friend and said that he only wanted to talk to the lady. He did not understand what had happened at all. Cullen smiled and apologized to the young lady for his friend's rudeness, and also said that her riding position was original. In a hurry, he put his friend on the horse. The young lady, in turn, returned to the estate with a victorious smile. Some time later, Sarah was shocked, as she noticed that the young lady had injured herself. Maivia looked at her leg in surprise, realizing that the demon blood did not increase her stamina. Sarah was shocked, as she knew that under such circumstances, the lady would not be able to attend the imperial ball. Sarah shouted that her mistress was really looking forward to this reception. Maivia was surprised it was the first time she heard that she was looking forward to the reception. Sarah shouted madam that she had bought a lot of things, and did not say that she would be present at the reception. Sarah shouted that she would put a compress on her ankle every day, so that she would be fine. She smiled and said that she was not sad about it. A moment later, she looked at the cute raven and asked how he was doing. She smiled and told the raven that he must have seen her, and how amazing she looked. She smiled and said that if the Grand Duke saw her, he would fall in love with her. A moment later, the raven flew up to the letter. She was surprised and asked if he was really hungry. Sarah looked at her mistress with tears in her eyes and said that even the raven wanted this. At the same time, the raven screamed and demanded that she go to the reception. The young lady sighed heavily and thought. She was puzzled and irritated by everything, but she saw that they really wanted her to go there. She knew that Gilbert would try to look his best to impress the ladies. She sighed heavily as the person she really wanted to see would not come. Maivia realized today that it was very difficult to interest the Grand Duke. Maivia wondered if she should hurt herself more next time so that Gilbert would call the Duke himself. Maivia threw the sword to her maid and asked her to throw it away. Sarah was surprised and did not understand how she could throw such an expensive thing into the trash. Sometime later, early in the morning, the young lady greeted her parents. The Marquis sighed heavily and told his daughter that she was late, but she in turn asked for forgiveness. They looked at her intently and said that she should sit next to them quickly. The lady looked at her daughter and asked if she was doing well lately. She smiled and said that she was fine. Maivia smiled and said that they shouldn't worry, because she was doing well. Judging by the original novel, the parents were always indifferent to the young lady. Unfortunately, she could only watch them go. Even on her 6th birthday, she was left alone in an empty house. The following Christmas, they were also completely absorbed in work, and did not pay any attention to it. Maivia was surprised, and did not understand why they suddenly became interested in her affairs. The Marquise said that she shouldn't worry too much, as their family was able to cope, even with what their child was causing. The Marquise smiled and asked her daughter if she remembered how old she was when she lay down on the floor to prevent them from leaving. The young lady laughed and said that it was simply impossible to forget. She knew that half of the family's fortune was at stake, and since on that day, they were going to invest in the damned shipping company. She was little and knew that logic wouldn't convince them, so she made a scene, and now she felt a little ashamed to remember it. Maivia said it was an old story. Marquise smiled and said that it was, but for them, she was still a child. The Marquise said that before they didn't even understand that she was a child from childhood, she seemed like an adult to them. That's why they thought she didn't need them. But they knew that wasn't true at all. That was the first time they saw her childish hysteria. She screamed that she wanted to be with them. The Marquise looked closely at her daughter and said that even now she keeps everything to herself, just like you did in childhood. Mavia thought she could change the fate of the family, but she never believed she could change the atmosphere in the family. Her parents said that since she had not found a partner for the ball, then they could go together, holding hands as before. She smiled and said that it was not so, and she had not intended to go to the ball at all. But at that very moment, a raven flew into their hall, and the servant asked for forgiveness, as he was too nimble. The Marquis looked at his daughter in surprise, and asked if she knew the bird. She smiled and said that it was her pet. She knew her parents had excellent powers of observation. She was afraid that they might realize that it was a magical creature. The madam told her daughter that her taste had changed greatly. Mavia said that her pet was hungry, so she would quickly finish and come to them. Some time later, they came to her room, and she asked anxiously what had happened. Mavia asked her pet if he really wanted to convey something urgently. But at that very moment, the raven spat out the imperial seal of the house. She was surprised, because she knew that the seal was on the invitation. Mavia told the raven that he himself had heard that she did not have a partner, and also asked if he really wanted to become her partner. She looked at him sharply and said that they should think about the height difference. Mavia smiled and said that unfortunately, if he couldn't dance, he couldn't be called a partner. But in turn, he flapped his wings and said that this was not so. A few seconds later, Mevia asked with a joyful smile if the man would really come. The servant looked at the Duke intently and asked when he would give the order to leave. The Duke said that he would go first, and they should follow him. At that very moment, he used his magic to go to the capital. Sometime later, the young lady returned to her parents and thanked them for inviting her to the ball. Childishly again, and they said that if it was about an old contract, they would sort it out. Maivia, looking at her parents with complete seriousness, said that she wanted to fulfill the terms of the contract. The Marquise was taken aback and said that among the men in the house, there was only a child left. She shouted that he was not talking about the child now. Maivia smiled and said that there was still one unmarried gentleman there. She smiled and said that she was talking about the Duke himself. Everyone thought that the Duke was an old man with gray hair. The Marquise said that she understood her daughter, but the Marquis was furious and asked his wife if she would really give permission for such a marriage. The Madame told her daughter that she really didn't understand her, since she didn't even realize that she had given away her heart. The Marchioness said that she thought the Duke would come to the ball, and so she would talk to him there. The Marquise also said that they missed socializing, so they could arrange a family trip on the day of the ball. She told her where they could go, but the young lady froze in shock, as she knew her mother wanted to send her to a country on a neighboring continent. She told her parents that they had misunderstood her, as the Duke looked much younger than his age. The Marquise, restraining her anger, told her daughter to immediately pack her things. Sometime later, the young lady tried on her outfit for the ball. She danced joyfully near the mirror, because she did not know which fan to choose. Sarah looked at the lady closely and said that for someone who didn't want to go to the ball, she was very active. She smiled and asked if it was all because the Duke was not an old man. Mavia sighed heavily and irritably told her maid not to talk about it. Sarah said that rumors had already spread around the mansion, but she was worried what if the Duke did not show up to the ball or turned out to be an old man. Looking at the young lady, Sarah said that she would have to go to another continent. She asked if the Duke was really coming. The young lady was taken aback and said that they needed to check everything again, and also asked where the raven was. Sarah looked at the lady in bewilderment, as she did not understand why she needed the raven, since she had not seen him since the morning. Sometime later, the young lady arrived at the celebration at the feast. Everyone was discussing Sora, which was organized earlier on the street by young people. They said that the young lady was very proud, but still fell for her appearance. The lady said she was very beautiful and had a business acumen. The young man smiled and asked what kind of grip she was talking about, since the quarry she had previously bought for a lot of money was closed due to monsters. Monica looked at everyone closely and said that it was when she was little, and she was not the kind of person they could talk about so casually. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly and sipped her drink. She looked at the good wine with pleasure, but in turn, she was very confused, since she did not understand why the Duke did not come. She thought the raven had hinted to her that the Duke would come to the ball, and so she wondered if she had been mistaken. A moment later, she flinched as she heard her friend's voice. Monica looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she was glad to see her. Mavia did not expect to meet her friend at all. Mavia sighed heavily, knowing that her friend had heard everything, and now she felt uncomfortable. Monica looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if it was really her and the wrinkled old man who did this. Mavia looked at the lady she had found with bewilderment. Monica screamed angrily and asked her friend why she hadn't responded to the letter she had sent her. Mavia was surprised and said that she did not remember receiving the letter. Mavia became thoughtful as she remembered the recent letter. Monica said that she waited for an answer every day. Mavia said that she did not consider such a letter worthy of a response. Monica was shocked, but the young lady only smiled and asked for forgiveness. A moment later, the young lady looked at her companion with a grin. She came closer to her and asked for forgiveness with a smile, since Anna had recently experienced many disturbing events. Mavia smiled and told the young lady that she had snapped at her, even though they barely knew each other. She smiled and asked if she could forgive her. Monica was taken aback and shouted at the young lady not to do something for which she would later have to apologize. Monica screamed that she would not give in to banal compliments about her beauty. Mavia looked at the lady with bewilderment. Monica sighed heavily and said that she had not come for idle talk, as she wanted to discuss business. Mavia said with surprise that business matters were best discussed with her parents. But Monica said that the issue concerned the territory which she owned. She said she wanted to talk about the rock quarry she had bought years ago that was now infested with monsters. Monica said that she would support her in her research, and also asked if she could buy that land. Mavia said that it was impossible. Monica was in shock and screamed young lady that this land was of no use to her. But suddenly, they reported that young Master Gilbert had arrived. Gilbert looked at everyone present with a fierce grin. The young lady sighed heavily because she knew that someone she did not want to see had arrived. She was puzzled because she didn't know what a lass was so beautiful about him, because he had eyes that were slanted like everyone else's. Monica shouted to her friend with lightning speed that she would quickly leave for a short while. A few seconds later, Monica ran up to the young man and greeted him with a joyful smile. Mavia was shocked and wondered if they really knew each other. She didn't understand when they had managed to cross paths. She quickly ran up to her friend and called her with a smile. Mavia smiled and said young lady that they could continue their conversation. Gilbert looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was very good that she had come. They discussed among themselves for some time, and everyone watched them closely. He looked at her with suppressed anger and said that she was still very witty. Mavia sighed heavily and said goodbye to him. She looked closely at her friend and asked if they had anything to talk about. Mavia looked intently at the young man and said that he could talk about her power as much as he wanted, because no one would believe him anyway. But a moment later, the young man knelt before the young lady and said according to the ancestral agreement, he respectfully wanted to ask her. He looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile and asked her to marry him. Gilbert knew that a public proposal was difficult to refuse, and even if she refused, she would never marry. He knew that she had no choice, and so he asked her with a smile to become his wife. But at that very moment, he was taken aback as wine poured on him. He was in shock and screaming because the wine had gotten into his eyes. He didn't understand what was happening at all. The emperor said that it seemed that he had come to him because he had done something wrong. The duke told him that there was no need to be afraid, since he had only responded to an invitation. The duke said he had been wondering who the current emperor was, but apparently not much time had passed. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it was so. He was furious because the north was ignoring the imperial orders, so he asked his father to give the order. But the emperor said that the north could not be touched, because only he could control the demonic beasts. The emperor looked intently at his son and told him to listen to him carefully. Now the emperor trembled with fear as he looked at his opponent. The emperor knew that the man was not at all a simple man like the rest of them. Mavia sighed heavily and said that she was wrong, because she thought that it was just a dream. She sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry. Gilbert was furious. He shouted that this was no excuse. He asked if this was how a mature lady behaved. But everyone turned away from him and did not say a word. They sighed heavily as they understood that the young man was unrequitedly in love. But no matter how much he insisted, she still refused him. Gilbert was furious. He looked around, but no one supported him. Mavia looked at him with a smirk, as she understood that he needed to choose better whom to oppose. Although the empire possessed a vast territory, the failure of maritime trade weakened the king's power, after which all power passed to several wealthy families. Marquisate Elaine had power in the empire. Also, power passed to the Marquis Morgause. Marquis Morgan, at the head of the young lady. The Marquise looked closely at her daughter, and holding back her rage said that if she needed help, she should contact them. The man looked closely at the young lady, and said with a smile that although he understood her feelings, she should think about the young man's reputation. She coldly called the Baron, and he was taken aback. She looked at him intently, and told him that the rope he was holding onto now would not save him, and he must act wisely. The young man froze in place in shock without uttering a word. Gilbert sighed heavily and said that in the north, there is no one sane here. The young lady in turn looked at him with a satisfied smile. She saw that he was burning with rage, but she only mocked him. A moment later, the servant introduced himself and told the young lady that His Majesty requested to meet her in person. She was surprised, as she did not expect this. The trembling man said that everything was correct, and he had been waiting for her for a long time. Some time later, the young lady following her escort noticed that it was cold outside. She froze in place for a moment, not understanding what was going on at all, as the atmosphere was very serious. She saw that the neat man looked confused, and his face was pale to the point of blueness. She looked at the man intently and asked if he could tell her why the emperor had summoned her. Trembling with fear and sweating profusely, he said he could only say that she had brought this upon herself. The young lady was shocked because she did not expect this, but a moment later, she turned around as she heard some conversation in the distance. She looked into the distance as she realized whose conversation she had overheard. She shouted to her escort that she would step away for a few minutes. The man was in shock. He shouted and called for the young lady, but it was all in vain. Monica looked closely at the young man and said that it seemed like he was very offended. She sighed heavily and said that her friend had always been like that because as a child, she apparently hit her head and often did strange things. Gilbert looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked why she was doing this to him. He looked at her intently, waiting for an answer. Monica sighed heavily and said that she simply understood him. Monica said with a gentle smile, looking at the young man, that in fact she didn't like her too much either. At the same time, Mavia stood behind her friend and heard everything. Monica smiled a predatory grin and said that she wished that things were worse for Maevia than for her. And sometimes she even wished misfortune on her. Maevia was shocked, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. She wondered if she should ignore their conversation, but she knew that if she left, it would no longer be inappropriate behavior, and perhaps they would live happily as a harmonious couple. However, she had no intention of doing such a thing, and looking at the young lady, she told her to stop saying such things. Monica was taken aback, and turned around, looking at the young lady, asking how long she had been standing there. Maevia looked at her friend coldly and angrily, but did not answer. Monica was taken aback, and asked the young lady in confusion if she had really heard everything. Maevia looked at the lady intently, and said that she would give her one piece of advice, the first and last one of her life. Looking at her, she said that she should stay away from the young man, and that it would be better for her son never to meet him again. Gilbert was furious at this statement. A moment later, he rushed towards her with lightning speed and shouted that she should not have come to them. Monica screamed in surprise, as she did not expect to see something like this. At the same time, the young lady froze in place in surprise. She was taken aback, as she realized that she had let her guard down, and thought that she shouldn't have interfered after all. But he ran towards her, and reached his hands towards her thin neck. At the same time, Gilbert looked at her with a fierce grin, because he knew that he would immediately finish her off. Monica was in shock. She screamed and called for the young Ice One. It was all in vain. Malvia closed her eyes and smiled tenderly as she realized that this end was predetermined. But a moment later, she opened her eyes as nothing had happened. At that very moment, someone stopped the young man's hand and said that he should control himself. Gilbert was furious. He did not understand what had happened, and writhing in pain, screamed for him to be released immediately. The Duke looked at his son with a cold, intent look and said that it was time for them to go home. The description of his plot was one country after another. He was strong enough to subjugate ferocious monsters with his ease, but he almost never left his chambers, so there were very few people who saw him, and those who had the chance to see the Grand Duke at least once were unable to open their mouths. He exuded a decadent aura from his black uniform, and in the long corners of her eyes, like masks from the devil's hand, there lurked an unusual seductiveness. She was shocked because she understood that the description from the novel was completely insufficient. The young lady was taken aback and froze in embarrassment. She understood that in front of her was simply a faceless god. Gilbert was furious and shouted to his father that it was just a misunderstanding, and the young lady had set everything up to destroy him. Maevia was taken aback and didn't know what to answer, but Gilbert screamed. The knights said they would escort him right away. He was furious and screamed to be released immediately. He did not understand why his father treated only him so mercilessly. Meanwhile, the emperor, sitting in the bushes, was trembling with fear. He called the young lady, and she looked at him in bewilderment. He asked for forgiveness for asking such a thing. But he said that since he had arranged a meeting for her with the Grand Duke, she should tell him that he had left first. The young lady looked at the emperor in bewilderment, but still agreed. Maevia understood that the Grand Duke had ordered his adjutant to call her. The Duke sighed heavily, and they looked at him in bewilderment, because they did not know what he would do. He said angrily that the young man was still expecting him to chew it once and put it in his mouth. He was furious because he understood that he had trained him poorly. The emperor was taken aback and froze, which is why he stood there. The Duke turned around and looked angrily at everyone present. Trembling with fear, the emperor ran away with the speed of lightning. The man looked intently at the young lady and said that he would escort her. After some time, the young lady was left alone with the Grand Duke. She looked at him closely, as he certainly looked like the villain of villains. But she wondered if he was so scary that she would run away at the first sight. Mavia looked at him with admiration, because she understood that no matter how much she looked, the first thought that came to her mind was that he was incredibly handsome. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she had rejected Gilbert's proposal. The Duke said that she looked like he was a suitable candidate for a husband. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. The Duke looked at her intently and asked why she wanted to marry someone like him. He sighed heavily and said that he had to know the real reason. The young lady hesitated for a moment, searching for the words to answer his question. She knew it was all because she knew the future, which she didn't choose. In the original story, immediately after the wedding, Gilbert sent her north. And 6 months later, he summoned her back to his capital with unclean intentions. She was delighted because he wanted to meet her, but unfortunately, she did not know what fate awaited her. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she did not have to come to him, and if she wanted to, she could stay in the north. She knew he was the only one who warned her. But then the young lady on the contrary was afraid of him, so she tried to escape but ended up falling into Gilbert's hands. But even then he came to her rescue. The Duke looked at her closely and asked if she would return to Numero. He extended his helping hand to her until the very end, although she was never able to hold on to his hand until the very end. She didn't know why, but he still tried to help the young lady. But now she knew for sure that if the real Mavia had taken his hand, then a less terrible end would not have awaited her. She extended her hand to him with a smile and asked if he would like to dance with her. Mavia knew that this time she would definitely be by his side. He looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected this. Mavia smiled and said that she would like to dance with him if he was interested in anything she would tell him while they danced. Of course, she had no intention of telling him the truth, but she knew that this would definitely attract his attention. Mavia looked at the young man with a joyful smile, but he said that he did not want this. She was taken aback, as she had not expected such a thing. Mavia, looking at the Duke, said that if it was difficult for him to dance, she could teach him, but he also firmly said that he did not want this. She was shocked and didn't understand why he refused. He sighed heavily and said that it was just a lot of trouble. Mavia looked at him in bewilderment. She was puzzled, as he had said earlier, that he was interested. He sighed heavily and said that the feeling of laziness outweighed his curiosity. The Duke sighed heavily and asked in this regard if he could return home. Looking at the young lady, he said that further communication would be through the exchange of letters. He said that this was also very troublesome and asked if they could finish there. Mavia was shocked, and looking at the young man, she realized that he was very picky, even more than she could have expected. She smiled and said that since he had come, wouldn't it be a shame for him to leave without enjoying the ball? He sighed heavily and said that he was an introvert. He turned around and walked away, wanting to get home as quickly as possible, but he still said goodbye to her. But the young lady in turn was not going to give up so easily. She ran up to the Duke and grabbed him by the clothes and also asked him in a hurry to wait. Mavia looked at the young man with puppy dog eyes and said that she really wanted to dance, but unfortunately, she didn't have a partner. He froze in shock for a moment. The young lady in turn was puzzled as she realized what she had just done. She sighed heavily as she realized that it was too much on her part. The Duke, looking at the young lady, asked if one dance would be enough for her. She was surprised because she didn't expect him to agree so quickly. He looked at her intently and said that he had asked her earlier if one dance would be enough for her. She was shocked and wondered if her little cunning plan had worked. Mavia looked closely at her companion and with a gentle smile said that he should be careful as the floor was very slippery. He sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness, as he was very clumsy. He also said that he was not really a very good dancer, and he forced himself to go through such torment because he wanted to get to know her better. Mavia looked at him with a tender smile and asked if he didn't hate her. He sighed heavily and said embarrassedly that of course it wasn't so, and he wouldn't dare. She smiled and said that she would tell him everything about herself and about the dance, and she would also teach him the beautiful dance. But all her expectations were shattered to pieces. When she saw that they had gone out onto the dance floor and everyone else had run away, Mavia looked intently at her companion. She hoped that he wasn't going to run away from her, as she could barely hold back her tears. She was in shock, wondering if she would really dance without music. But having gathered her strength, she decided to concentrate on dancing. She knew that sooner, she would have an even greater desire to win. Meanwhile, the Duke looked coldly and angrily at everyone present, while the young lady enjoyed her dance. The guests trembled with fear, as his ferocious appearance alone filled them with terrible anxiety. But despite everything, the young lady enjoyed the dance and twirled with her companion. She smiled, but after a few seconds, she asked the Duke with alarm what was going on. She was shocked. She couldn't understand how a man who had never even set foot in high society had suddenly learned to dance so superbly. He sighed heavily and said that he had never learned to dance, and he was very glad that it did not look strange. Maevia said his words sounded as if he was born with such a talent. He sighed heavily and said that perhaps it was so. She only laughed in response. Mavia looked closely at the young man and said that she seemed to have guessed correctly. She asked if the dance was easy for him. He froze for a moment in surprise as she gave him the most beautiful smile. He was shocked because he saw that she was not only not afraid of him, she was open and expressed sympathy. The Duke in turn suggested that perhaps this was her trick. He looked at her intently and said that he had no idea what she was planning. But for now, he wanted to give in to her prank. Sometime later, the young lady was taking a bath and was deep in thought. She remembered him smiling tenderly and saying he would give in to her prank. She blossomed when she heard his words and asked with a smile if he really meant to say that he was going to marry her. He let the nth lady go and said that regarding this, they could leave this conversation for later. She was shocked as she did not expect this. But at that very moment, Maevia noticed how he, with the help of his power, was dissolving right before her eyes. As he disappeared, he said with a smile that she would just have to wait a little while. She froze in shock when she saw that he was gone. Maevia was furious and did not understand how the Duke could just disappear in the middle of the banquet hall. But what annoyed her even more was that he did not come again. She was furious and wondered if he would return only in 10 years. Maevia sighed heavily, knowing she would think about it a little later after a good night's sleep. A moment later, the young lady hugging her toy fell asleep. Maevia looked at Cinderella with a fierce grin and told him to rub harder, because if she didn't like it, he would have fried potatoes for dinner. He begged for mercy with tears in his eyes as he did not want any more fried potatoes. The young lady opened her eyes and was taken aback by shock. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise and asked how much she had drunk at the banquet. Maevia sighed heavily and said that it was not because of the alcohol at all. The maid told the young lady to wipe her mouth first and also asked her mistress if she should be told that she would be back later, as the Duke himself was in the hall. Sometime later, the young lady finally met with the Grand Duke of the North. She sighed heavily and asked if it wasn't urgent. Could he come a little later? After he left yesterday, he returned early in the morning, and at that time, she was simply dying of fatigue. The Duke looked at her intently and said only her name. She looked at him in surprise, but he said that she could call him by his name, and they could switch to informal speech. She smiled and said that it wouldn't work, because she had a harsh tongue and usually spoke formally to everyone. He smiled and said that then she would have no choice. A moment later, he snapped his fingers and summoned a magic circle. Maevia was taken aback, as she did not expect to see anything like this. She knew that if he got rid of his future wife, it would most likely not be a breach of contract. She knew that this was a workaround, so she shouted in a hurry as she was very scared. But a moment later, the young lady froze in surprise as she saw only a piece of paper. She was surprised when she saw the information that was on paper. He smiled and said that even if she wanted to sleep, she still needed to look at the details of the marriage. She saw the marriage certificate from the ancestor's contract, even with the imperial seal. She looked closely at the young man and wondered if he shouldn't be lazy. She didn't understand why his voice was so gentle. She had the feeling that he was not persuading a person, but a cat or a dog. Maevia asked in confusion if that was why he had disappeared last night. He smiled and said that she was as insightful as always. She sighed heavily and said that next time he should warn her before disappearing. She smiled and said that otherwise she might say very unpleasant words to him. The Duke smiled and said that if that was so, then he would gladly try to accommodate his wife's wishes. A moment later, the Duke looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that he had no intention of getting a divorce. She smiled and said that she also did not intend to do that until he made her life hell. He asked in surprise if she really wanted to spend the rest of her life with the man she had met only yesterday. Maevia said with a smile that there are many fictitious marriages that later become very successful. Duke said that having children would be very difficult since his body is a little different. While sipping her tea, she calmly said that she would be informed about this. She had no romantic illusions at all about 6 children. The Duke asked if there was anything else she was interested in. Maevia thought for a moment and asked how old he was. He sighed heavily and said that he had once met the first Lord Kalakis before he became a Grand Duke, when he was just a man who wandered through dangerous places with a pretty face. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that he was indeed very ancient. She smiled and said that she would not be surprised if he already had great-grandchildren running around his great-grandchildren. He sighed heavily and said that he had never had children and still does not. She looked at him in surprise and asked, "What about a mistress?" He said that he did not have one. She also asked what about secret affairs. He coldly said that he was sorry to disappoint her, but he did not have secret affairs. The Duke sighed heavily and asked if she wasn't curious as to how he was still alive. Edith looked intently at the young lady and said that she must understand what it meant that he had met the very first lord. She smiled and said she knew that, but right now she was more interested in his personal life. Mavia smiled and said she was wondering about the secret to his incredibly long life. She'd ask when she was older, though if he wanted to tell her how he'd stayed forever young, she wouldn't mind. Mavia smiled and said that if he ever wanted to share the secret of his immortality, he should tell her just as she would want to share it with her parents. He looked at her in surprise, but a moment later, he sighed heavily and said that if he ever wanted, he would share this information with her. The Duke asked if she wanted to know anything else. She said she had run out of questions, but she had one condition. She said she was going to live in his lands, which were completely foreign to her, with only one maid with her whom she could take with her and whom she could trust. She knew that his lands were clearly colder and harsher than the center of the empire. She said it scared her, and she might run into people who hated her or monsters. He looked at her in surprise and asked what the conditions were that she was so desperately worried about. He said that depending on what it was, he could decide whether to agree to it or not. She was glad as she had caught him in her net. She looked intently at her future husband and said that one of her bruises was worth 1,000,000 coins. He was shocked, as he did not expect such a thing. She looked at him with a smile and announced the cost of minor injuries, burns, fractures, or amputations. A moment later, she showed him the new contract with a smile and asked if everything was okay with him. The Duke looked at her with a grin and asked what she thought of his lands in general. Mavia said with a smile that she knew it sounded funny, but she also asked what Grand Duchess could suffer while living in a Grand Duchy. She smiled and said that she was not so ordinary and great. She wanted to take a place that had remained vacant for too long, and someone might not like the unplanned arrival of a new government. He looked at her in surprise, asked if she really thought that he would just sit and silently watch everything. She said with a smile that he could think of it as insurance, since she was one of those who prepared for all possible outcomes of a situation. Mavia knew that this was an excuse on her part, as the real reason was a little different. She knew that Gilbert was also heading north, and when she arrived north, she would be alone. Mavia knew that at that time, Gilbert's dogs would be hanging around her. And even if she plays dirty, it doesn't guarantee her victory. And at least if she gets beaten, she deserves compensation. The Duke said that if she was really scared, she could take someone else with her, and he would even let her take every last soldier from her family's personal army if she wanted. She smiled and asked why she should waste her energy if she already had an incredible husband who was much stronger than everyone else. He sighed heavily and said that it didn't seem like she trusted her incredible husband at all. Mavia said with a smile that this was only their second meeting. He smiled and said that she had seemed braver to him, but now she looked more like a frightened little rabbit. Mavia winked at her fiancé and said that a rabbit wife was just perfect for her. He looked at her intently and said that if she agreed with everything she should sign. A moment later, the young lady stood up and approached the young man. She looked at him intently and asked if he knew that there was a tint of purple in his eyes. The Duke froze in shock, as no one had ever done anything like that to him before. She smiled and said that his eyes were just like sparkling purple stars in the depths of the dark blue ocean. He was embarrassed by her words, and with a trembling voice asked what kind of nonsense she was talking about. Mavia looked at the young man with a satisfied smile, because she saw that he was embarrassed, and it was quite sweet. She smiled and said that it was still nice to know a little more about him before the wedding. She said that he knew a lot about her, which she knew almost nothing about him. And it was unfair. Mavia said with a smile that now it doesn't feel so strong when this. He asked in surprise if she wasn't afraid. She always skillfully asked what she should be afraid of. Was it his lands or the wedding? He looked at her intently, said that he was talking about himself now. Mavia looked at him with bewilderment, and said that beautiful people did not frighten her. The Duke sighed heavily and asked if there were any more conditions. She smiled and said that was all. He sighed heavily and said that in that case, he would accept them too. And now it was her turn. She smiled and agreed. Finally, she signed it, and a few seconds later, it was gone. Maevia was surprised to see real magic she knew about it, but seeing it in person still felt completely different. She smiled and said that she wondered what they were like, those people who created the contract. The Duke smiled and asked if she wanted him to show her where their graves were. Maevia smiled and said that it sounded very tempting, but she would probably refuse since something told her that he might actually do it if she said so. Finally, the promise between their families was finally fulfilled. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was now the Grand Duchess. The young lady thought about what he said for a moment, but for some reason, it felt like she had not received the title of Grand Duchess, but rather had become part of the Demon King's army. She looked at her husband with admiration, because she knew that she did not need to pay attention to such things, since she still had a handsome husband. Maevia, while drinking tea, asked her husband with a smile when they would return to the estate. He smiled and said that they could return any time his wife wanted. She smiled and asked that if she said that she wanted to go, right now, would he allow her? He smiled and asked how he could refuse her. Maevia sighed heavily and said that she was just joking, because before leaving, she had to say goodbye to her parents. He glanced sideways at the door and said that he thought there were people who wanted to say goodbye to her, besides her parents. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, a maid came in and apologized for interrupting them. But a letter had arrived from the young lady, and she thought that the mistress should know about it immediately. Mavia was surprised that they were writing to her at such an hour. She sighed heavily as she realized that the girl was most likely writing to her because of what had happened that day. She knew that Monica was more interested in Gilbert than the Grand Duke, and she must have wondered why she hated Gilbert so much that she called him a bastard. Mavia froze for a moment when she saw the contents of the letter. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she had received something urgent. Mavia said that this was not the case, and it seemed that her friend simply wanted to give her an invitation to a birthday party. She said that she could answer her later since it was not urgent. Sarah looked at her mistress intently and said that perhaps she should hurry. She looked at the maid in surprise as she did not understand why she needed to do something like that. Sarah said the messenger had conveyed that the lady had set out on a journey following the letter. Mavia sighed heavily, shocked because she knew that the young lady was going to come anyway. She didn't understand why she even asked about a convenient time for a meeting. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that he knew where she could hide. She followed through and said that if it was about the Grand Duke's estate, she would probably refuse now, as she did not want to run into his eldest son. He looked at her intently and said that if there was a reason for this, he could take care of it. She smiled and said that he didn't have to do that at all, and that it was okay, because if he took care of it, she doubted that this place would remain on Earth. He sighed heavily and asked with a smile while it was cleaned whether the location mattered. Edith said, looking at the young lady, that she should just tell him if there was anything she needed. She smiled and said that so far everything was fine, and she did not need his help. Mavia sighed heavily and asked the Grand Duke if they could continue their conversation in the living room, as another guest would be arriving soon. He smiled and said that he agreed, and then they could go right away. The Grand Duke looked at his wife with a smile and said that looking at her cute nightgown, he wondered what her everyday clothes looked like. Mavia froze in shock and looked intently at the mirror, as she couldn't figure out what was wrong with her clothes. She was in shock as the realization dawned on her that she was still in her nightgown. She was embarrassed and shouted to her maid to help her get ready quickly. The young man said that he had never seen anyone so beautiful because she was so noble that it turned out that she could even change the flow of air. He knew that if she became the Grand Duchess, then all the ice floes in the north would melt because she was just like the goddess of spring. But he was furious because his friend dared to quarrel with the young goddess, not knowing his place. Sometime later, the young people discussed this situation. They heard that the Duke was dragging a young lady to the dance floor, and at that time, there was total chaos on the dance floor. The young man was shocked because he did not expect that the young lady was dancing with their Duke. He did not understand how such a beautiful flower, how she could get involved with the Duke. They discussed this topic and said that it would be better if she married the second young gentleman, but unfortunately, they were aware that marriage with minors is not prohibited by law. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was very worried because he did not know if someone so fragile and innocent could endure something like this. Gilbert was furious because he knew they were just crazy. He looked at them sideways and asked if they were really saying that the young lady was fragile and innocent. He said that it was very funny and he just couldn't stop. Gilbert looked at his friend intently and asked with a smirk if he wasn't curious about what she was really like. He said he could tell you in detail what she was really like, the new Grand Duchess. The young man pretended not to hear his friend and asked his companion when they were returning to the estate. Gilbert was furious because the young man ignored him. They knew that it was time for them to leave, but they did not know when his lordship would decide to return back. They were puzzled and did not know what to do with the elder gentleman. Gilbert looked at the young man closely and called him. He said that if they were leaving soon, he would like to say goodbye to his friends. The young man looked at the young gentleman with a grin and asked if he really had any friends and did not know who was friends with such an asshole who beat his brother. He said with a fierce mockery that birds of the same feather walk together. Gilbert was furious, and looking at the young man, he said he must be blind. He did not understand how he dared to bark at his master like a stray dog. The young man looked closely at the gentleman and told him to watch his language because their master was not him, but the Grand Duke. They sighed heavily and asked the young gentleman to sit down and stop making a fuss. Gilbert looked at them with anger and said that they had not yet come to their senses. He knew that disobedient dogs needed to be trained, so he called upon magic and began to summon his sword. He knew that even if they were both elite knights, nothing bad would happen if a little blood was spilled. Gilbert knew that if his father found out about this, he would have to suffer some punishment, but he could not allow them to treat him like this. A moment later, he looked at them with a fierce grin, holding his sword in his hand. He shouted that this was all because of themselves, and now they should not regret their words. He shouted that he would kill them immediately. A moment later, he was taken aback, as he felt something sticky on his sword. They mocked him, asking which friend he wanted to say goodbye to, wincing from the stench. They said that this was the perfect choice for him. Gilbert was shocked, as he did not understand why his sword was all dirty. A moment later, he threw down his sword with cold fury. He was furious, and did not understand how they dared to look down on him. The young people sighed heavily, and said that he simply had a terrible character. They wanted to do something as soon as possible to get rid of the terrible smell. The young man looked at Gilbert intently, and asked if the friend he wanted to see was the Baron Gilbert, sighed heavily, and said that it was true. The knight said that he would deliver his message to the Baron, so that he would calm down. And of course, given the situation, he doubted that the Baron would come to him. Gilbert looked at the young man sharply, and said that he should have started with this from the very beginning. After a few minutes, they decided to leave, leaving him alone. They left and closed the door tightly. Procyon, looking at his comrade, asked if he was sure that they should go to his friend, because he was worried that the Lord could create problems. He knew that the Duke was now in the capital, and if even knowing this he created trouble, he would pay with his life for his stupidity. Some time later, the Baron finally came to meet his friend. He looked closely at Herbert and said that it turned out that he was returning to the estate. The Baron told him to make sure that he would keep a low profile and remain silent. Gilbert sighed heavily and said that he would not remain silent, since after everything that had happened, the Duke had arrived in the capital. Gilbert looked at his friend with a smirk and said that he needed his only friend to do something for him. The Baron looked at the young man intently and said that if it was related to the young lady, then he should forget about it, as he valued his life. Gilbert asked with a smirk, who said that it was related to her. Gilbert said there was a dark-haired maid who was always around her, and if they got rid of her, maybe he would feel a little better. As he left, the Baron said he would pretend he had not heard it at all, as he knew the young lady was not one to sit idly by while her people were touched. The Baron was shocked because he knew that Gilbert was simply crazy. He understood that his friend could no longer think clearly, and therefore he wanted to immediately switch to the other side. Gilbert looked after his friend with a grin and said that regarding their joint business in the north, he would like to talk, as he heard that the Baron was unhappy with the distribution of profits. The Baron froze in shock, and looking at his friend, asked if it was really him who was threatening him. Now Gilbert said that it was, and the Baron had helped him many times, but even knowing this, he did not take care of him properly. The Baron looked at his friend in surprise, and asked if he was really speaking seriously now. Gilbert said if he could just get rid of this nasty feeling a little, he could be a little more generous. He said with a grin that he would gladly share with his friend, and would not offend him. He looked closely at the young man, and with a grin said that he would like to ask him something one last time. He asked his friend with a fierce grin if he could do him a favor. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what exactly was the misunderstanding. She was shocked and screamed that her nightgown was a misunderstanding. She was in shock because she came out to the young man without realizing what she was wearing, as she was still sleepy. She felt very ashamed that she saw him in such a way. She screamed that he should know that she just forgot to change her clothes. She screamed that it was absolutely not what you might think, so he shouldn't have misunderstood her because she did it by accident. He smiled and said that they could have just forgotten about it. A moment later, the young lady was brought her order, but she froze in place in surprise because no matter how much she looked at the drink, it was not what she ordered. She sighed heavily as she realized that this was not the drink she had been dreaming about, but she could not say anything as she could see that the waitress was very nervous. She sighed heavily as she knew she would just drink the drink, but after one sip, she choked. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if something was wrong. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. He sighed heavily and sitting up said that it was very sad because she had lied to him from the very first day of their marriage. As he left, he said that she should wait a little. The lady froze for a moment in surprise. Mavia was puzzled because she didn't understand what had happened. Some time later, she nevertheless followed her husband. Opening the door slightly, she froze in surprise as she saw that her husband was cooking something. She froze and realized that he was preparing a drink for her. After a few minutes of hard work, her drink was ready. It was exactly like the picture. Edith presented his masterpiece to his wife and wished her bon appetit. She was surprised as the dessert was prepared by the Northern Grand Duke himself. She looked at the drink in surprise as it looked really appetizing. Mavia smiled and said that it looked just like the one on the menu, and the Duke smiled and said that he really hoped she would like the drink. She sighed heavily because she knew that she had to try it, and even if it didn't taste good, she had to pretend that she liked it. But a moment later, she was shouting with admiration that the taste was simply incredible. She said that her husband was even better than the imperial chefs in their estate. He looked at her with a smile and said that if there was any city food that she would like to eat when they went north, she could tell him. The young lady froze in place for a moment, embarrassed. He smiled tenderly and said that he would immediately prepare this dish for her. She was shocked because he was very different from what she had imagined. She thought he would be too lazy to come to the cafe at all. Mavia thought that he would definitely postpone signing the contract. She wondered if she had read the novel incorrectly, since he was definitely very lazy during the ball. Mavia had no idea what had made him change so much, but she didn't want to remind him of it. The lady smiled and said that in that case, she wanted to try some caramel pudding. Sometime later, they were sitting in the park earlier. The lady asked if the friend who wanted to come in the morning should have already left. He sighed heavily and said that it looked like it. Mavia looked closely at her husband and asked why he was saying this, as if he could see it. She asked in bewilderment if he was clairvoyant. Edith said that he only hears better than others and can hear even the quietest sounds. Mavia sighed heavily and wondered if it was because he was transcendental. She knew he had quite a lot of abilities. Mavia looked at her husband and said that it was really strange. He looked at her in bewilderment. She smiled and said that he had many abilities. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he must be like his biological father. She looked at him in surprise and asked who Gilbert's biological father was. The Duke sighed heavily and said that at first, he also tried to get closer to him. Edith said he was puzzled when he saw what Gilbert did to his mentor. The young lady froze for a moment, and since she did not remember anything being said about Gilbert's biological father in the novel, she wondered if this was not an unwanted adoption. The novel simply said that the Duke picked up 2 abandoned children in the desert. She thought the Duke was just being kind to them. She wondered if there were any hidden secrets. She looked at her in surprise and asked if there was a reason why he didn't give up on him. Edith sighed heavily and said that there was, but he couldn't tell her the details, but it was simply impossible to give him up. Edith looked intently at his wife and said that instead, if she wants to do something punish or something else, then she can feel free to do so. She was shocked, since it was difficult for him to refuse him. So she wondered if the biological father was threatened. If she had known that she would end up in a novel, her daughter would have definitely eaten it to the end. Mavia said with a smile that since she was now the Grand Duchess, she had power in her hands. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that she had previously said that she would take her maid with her. He asked if she was a close person to her. Mavia smiled and said that it was so, since the maid had helped her since childhood. He sighed heavily and said that he understood her. Mavia looked at the Duke warily and asked if something had happened to her son. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that this was all Gilbert's doing. He told his wife that the young maid had been attacked and was being taken away somewhere. He said the pig appeared to be fine and did not appear to be injured. The Duke said that surprisingly, her maid was very accommodating. At the same time, Sarah shouted that she had done what her mistress had ordered her to do. She looked intently at her captors and asked them to release her, but they in turn shouted at her to shut up immediately. The man looked at the maid with fury, since he had no intention of dealing with her himself. Sarah screamed that she would tell everything that needed to be said about her mistress, so they should let her go. She hoped that they would show mercy. The man looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to betray her mistress. She said with a smile that, of course, she would do everything and betray her. After all, she was only a hired maid. She said that she didn't even have a high salary, and she started counting her money in front of them and saying when she was paid her salary, the man was shocked. He told her to shut up, and he would trust her if she behaved more quietly. He sighed heavily and said that she must hurry and tell them about her mistress. Sarah said with a grin that she was closer to her than anyone else. She said it would not be an exaggeration to say that she knew everything about her. Of course, even her mortal weaknesses. Sarah looked at the young man intently and said that her mistress could not whistle. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said that it was indeed a very important weakness. She said that falconry was a must-have skill for an aristocrat, but her mistress could not whistle and therefore could not train the falcon. He sighed heavily and said that, technically, but on the rights. But a moment later, he said it was useless and weak. He said it was her last chance, and she had to tell him something really important. Sarah was taken aback as they put the daggers to her throat. She screamed and begged them for mercy, as she intended to tell everything she said, that her mistress slept very soundly in the mornings, so they could attack her, and she would not notice anything. She said her mistress hated sweet potatoes, cucumbers, onions, and tomatoes. She said they could plan to poison her by avoiding these foods. The young man was in shock. He did not understand what was happening at all, and from her chatter, his blood pressure jumped. He was in shock because he understood that this was pure madness, and he knew that the crazy mistress and her crazy maid attacked him. He looked closely at the young maid and wondered if he should kill her. He knew there would be no witnesses anyway. Therefore, with lightning speed, he headed towards the maid in order to deal with her quickly. But a moment later, the Grand Duke used his magic and ordered the Baron to stop. At that moment, the Baron was taken aback and screamed as the Grand Duke's magic enveloped him. He was in shock because he didn't understand what had happened and who was next to them. But a moment later, he clearly saw the Grand Duke and his wife standing before him. Mavia approached her maid and asked for forgiveness for coming so late. Mavia hugged her maid tightly and said that she must have been very scared, so they could quickly go home. The maid began to cry and called for her mistress. Mavia looked closely at the young man and said that she had already warned him earlier. She said that the rope he was holding onto was a rotting life preserver. The great duke looked at the young man with cold fury. The baron was in shock. He understood that punishment awaited him. At that very moment, the young people ran away with lightning speed. Mavia looked closely at her husband and asked if he was sure it was worth letting them escape. He smiled and said that it was okay, because he knew exactly who ordered the kidnapping. Edith looked at her and said that if that was the case, if she needed them, she should just tell him to take care of them. She smiled and said that this was definitely what she needed. But at the same time, Sarah was shaking with fear. The Duke looked intently at his wife and asked her to tell him everything. And if he could handle this matter. She looked at him with a smile and said that in that case, he could prepare the bridal room since she intended to come to the Grand Duke's residence that night. He looked at her confusedly and asked what she was talking about. Some time later, they went to the spirit manor. Mavia looked at her maid closely and called out to her, as she knew her maid was not usually so quiet. She knew she had no injuries, but it was still an injury. She looked closely at the maid and said that she would make sure that today's incident was counted as a work injury. Sarah blossomed after hearing something like this. She thanked the mistress because she knew that she was the best. Mavia looked at her maid with bewilderment, as she had clearly been sad a few minutes ago. She sighed heavily, as she felt that she had worried about her in vain. Sarah sighed heavily and said that she was kidnapped while she was packing things for the mistress, so she was not able to finish. She was in shock, did not know what to do. Maevia looked at her maid intently and said that given the circumstances, she had no other choice. Sarah looked at her mistress with joy, as she knew that she would not do anything to her. She said that her maid had exposed her weaknesses. Therefore, she intended to cut her salary for several months. Some time later, the lady returned to the estate. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked if she had come to talk about the kidnapping of her maid. Maevia looked at her mother in surprise and asked how she knew such a thing. Madame sighed heavily and said that they were a great family, and there was nothing that happened in the capital that they did not know about. Maevia, looking at her mother, said that it seemed that she also knew that she was heading north. Madame sighed heavily and said that of course she knew both about that, and also asked her daughter when she was leaving. Maevia said that in the evening, she was moving to the residence of the Grand Duke right after dinner. Maevia said that they decided not to have a wedding ceremony because they were in a hurry, and she also told her mother that she had officially become the Grand Duchess. Madame told her daughter that since she had already made her decision, she could not stop her, but still she could not stop worrying. The Madame sighed heavily, and looking at her daughter, said that she probably had reasons that she could not tell them. Mavia in turn mentally asked her parents for forgiveness, but she knew that there was little time left since a catastrophe would soon happen in the north. She knew that the attack could only be prevented in this way. Some time later, the Marquis and his wife stared intently after their daughter. The Marquis sighed heavily, as their daughter was indeed gone. She knew that their daughter was still very young, so she wondered if everything would be all right with her in the north. A moment later, the maid apologized for interrupting them, but the young lady told her to give them the letter when she left. The Marquis sighed heavily and said that it seemed their daughter understood that they would worry, so she left them a letter. Maevia wrote to her parents and asked them if they could put some pressure on Cullen's business for her sake after she moved north. She wrote that it was enough for Togo to go bankrupt and work in the mine. She thanked them and wrote that she loved them. She also wrote that she would invite them to the north every season, so they should not be too sad. Madame sighed heavily and asked if their daughter understood how far north was and how expensive it was there. The Marquis smiled and said that they earned money for this. Madame smiled and said that it was fair. The Marquis smiled and told his wife that as she had said, their daughter was still a bit childish, but he still wanted them to trust their son-in-law. They knew that he was the one their dearly beloved daughter had chosen. Some time later, the young lady and her maid went to the estate of the Grand Duke. Maevia was a little puzzled as she saw that there were only mountains everywhere. She wondered if his capital had once had a similar place. Sarah said that it was quite difficult to get from this place. She was very worried that they would suddenly give the lady bread as hard as stone or force her to clean the entire castle with ice water. Mavia sighed heavily and said that she didn't think it would come to that. She knew it was true that there would be no warm welcome for the unplanned Grand Duchess. Mafia said that if something like that happened, she would understand if her maid lost her composure. Some time later, they were informed that they had arrived at the Grand Duke's residence in the capital. But as soon as they stepped out of the carriage, the young lady froze in place in shock. A moment later, all the knights of the ducal house greeted the young lady and expressed their respect to the Grand Duchess. She froze in place in surprise, because I didn't understand what was wrong with them at all. The young man smiled and introduced himself to the young lady and said that he was the temporary manager of the estate. He asked permission to take her in, but a moment later, she froze in surprise as she saw a young man pushing his way through the crowd. Procyon, looking at his mistress, shouted that he would become a knight this year, and since Vega was busy, he would accompany her. The young lady froze for a moment in surprise. Sarah quietly asked her mistress if she had really sent them a gift in advance. She looked at everyone present in bewilderment and said that she didn't seem to have done anything like that. A moment later, the knights attacked his compatriot's word as they were furious that he had not greeted the Grand Duchess formally, and he was already climbing towards her. Vega looked at all the knights with fury as they behaved in an unseemly manner right in front of the Duchess. But the young man knew that there was nothing wrong with being beaten, because he had been waiting for this moment all day. Procyon also said that he had prepared a wonderful surprise, such that her ladyship would never think about divorce. He said that she does not eat at night, so everything is fine, and he had another plan. A surprise she can't refuse. This place with the best sunlight, moonlight, and morning dew, not too high, not too low, the perfect floor for a young lady. He also prepared a luxurious bed for her. She smiled and said that she looked very good. He looked at her with a smile and said that in that case, they could already get ready for bed. She looked at him intently and said that she would probably refuse such a tempting offer. The young man was shocked. He was very upset and depressed because his surprise had failed. At the same time, the Duke was taking a bath. He was puzzled because he told his subordinates to prepare everything perfectly, but she didn't like it. He suggested that perhaps his wife was offended and puffed out her little cheeks. He knew that if this wasn't the case, then perhaps she was already fast asleep in her nightgown. He smiled because he knew that tomorrow morning promised to be interesting. He walked slowly back to his room, knowing that by this time she should already be asleep. The Duke quietly entered his room, and after a few seconds, he froze in surprise on the spot, as the young lady said with a smile that quite a lot of time had passed. She looked at him with a playful smile, even though she was wearing a rather revealing outfit. With lightning speed, he turned around and asked for forgiveness. As he assumed he had mixed up the room, Mavia shouted at her husband to stop, as it was his room. Mavia looked at her husband closely and said that the bridal chamber she requested should not have been separate. He sighed heavily and said that he would first go and change his clothes. She smiled and said that she agreed with him, but he should not run away, so she suggested that he just hold hands and sleep. Sometime later, he changed his clothes and returned to her. They lay quietly in bed, but the young lady in turn sighed heavily and asked if simply holding hands was too difficult for him. Mavia said that they were already married now, and so she asked how about being a little closer to each other. She looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he could ask her everything that interested him. The Duke looked at her sideways and asked if he could really ask anything he wanted. She smiled and said that of course he could ask anything. He looked at her closely and asked how she had managed to defeat Gilbert that time, as he knew that such a level of skill would have been too difficult for an ordinary person. She sighed heavily and said that she had actually drunk the devil's blood. Mavia informed her husband that she had entered into a contract and received his blood fairly and honestly under the proper conditions. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect his wife to be associated with the ideal. She sighed heavily and said that this was not so because it was just an ordinary deal. Maevia said that in exchange for guarding his grave, she received blood. Fanat smiled and said that she was lucky then, and she doubted that she would be able to use it next time, since her body simply might not withstand such a thing. He looked at him intently and asked if she could tell him about the devil she had made a contract with. Maevia said that it was some very old man, and he even spoke like an ordinary person. The Duke looked at her intently and said that it was simply unbelievable. A moment later, the young lady asked with a smile if he could extend his ear to her for a second. And a few seconds later, she whispered something to him. The Duke stood frozen for a moment in surprise when he heard what she had said to him, and the young lady, in turn, only looked at him with a tender smile. He was taken aback and said that he must have heard her wrongly and asked her to repeat what she had said earlier. Mavia asked him with a smile to tell her what his parameters were and what his ideal was. She smiled and said that, after all, this was their first wedding night, and such questions should be asked. With lightning speed, the Duke wrapped his young wife in a blanket and told her that she needed to go to bed. She was in shock and screamed that he should at least let her breathe. The next day, the young lady slowly got ready and sighed heavily. She looked at her maid in bewilderment, as she did not understand why she was shaking so much with fear. She told her maid that if she was in trouble, she could help Sarah trembling with fear, thanked her mistress, but said that this was not possible. She saw that her maid was more frightened than usual. She thought that it was probably because they were in a confined space. She realized that it was like comparing a lion in a cage and a free lion. A moment later, the young lady looked at her husband in surprise. He told the maid to hand him the comb. A few seconds later, the stern northern Duke was doing his wife's hair. She looked at him with embarrassment as she felt his sweet care. She immediately felt that since they got married, she was his, but now she was interested in how far he would agree to go if she asked. Mavia looked closely at her husband as she saw that he always wore only black. She wondered if she should pick out some other color clothes for him. She knew he had very fair skin, and any shade would suit him. She knew that a strong brown would be very appropriate. A blue suit would match the tone of his beautiful eyes. She knew she could accentuate his hair color and dress him in a different style. Mavia asked her husband with a smile why he always wore only black. He looked at her in surprise and said that choosing colors was too tiring for him. She smiled and asked if there were any colors that didn't suit him. He said there weren't any. She smiled genuinely and laughed. And after a few seconds, she asked if he wanted to wear matching outfits with her once before leaving for the north. And she also said that they would need to meet her parents. At the same time, the young man standing in the kitchen was preparing an exquisite dish. He was full of enthusiasm as he wanted to cook something that the Grand Duchess would like. The young lady entered the room and greeted the young knight with a smile. He was taken aback as he did not expect to see her. She looked at him with a smile and asked why he cooked like that, as she knew he was a knight. He smiled and said that he had driven out someone and killed someone, and now the knights were replacing the servants. The young people were shocked that he said such a thing to the Duchess. Procyon smiled and said that the temporary butler, to whom she bowed yesterday, was the former commander of the knights. She was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing. She smiled and said that since the circumstances had turned out this way, she could now calmly entrust him with the task. He looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected such a thing. But the young Duchess asked the young man if he could fry the meat so that the smell would permeate her clothes. Some time later, Vega greeted the Duchess and said with a smile that the young gentlemen were now in a separate pavilion away from the main building. She looked at him with a smile. Mavia knew that this luxurious place was no worse than her bedroom. She wondered if he really thought that if he locked himself in such a place, he would repent. She knew that with this approach, he would never improve. A moment later, the young lady entered the room. Gilbert was taken aback, as he was not expecting anyone at all. Gilbert looked at the young lady with fury and asked what she was doing in his room. Mavia smiled and said that she was not his biological mother, but she felt that he had nevertheless crossed all the boundaries of what was permitted. He looked at her with fury. She smiled and said that they were going north for the weekend, and from that moment on, she would take good care of him as his adoptive mother. Mavia looked at the young man with a satisfied smile and said that she would deal with even his cute habit of picking at food. She had prepared a special ginger dish from Procyon for him. But a moment later, Gilbert angrily threw all the food onto the tables. She was shocked, as she did not expect this. At that very moment, the young knight burst into the room and asked the Grand Duchess if she was okay. He saw how the young gentleman threw away all the food that the Grand Duchess had brought. He was shocked and shouted at Gilbert that he had gone too far. He shouted that the Grand Duchess herself carried a heavy tray to treat him. He formerly did not understand how Gilbert could act in such a way. The Grand Duchess sighed heavily and said that she felt dizzy because the tray was very heavy. Vega looked at his mistress and said that he would immediately call a doctor. Mavia, in turn, looked with a satisfied grin at the young man's face, which was distorted with anger. She understood that apparently he had a bad premonition that she was going to give him an even worse surprise. The maid looked at her mistress intently and asked her with concern if she really wanted to do this. Mavia smiled, looking at her maid asking what exactly she wanted to do. Sarah looked at the lady with alarm and said that it was time to talk about the matter with young Master Gilbert, and that was all she was going to accept now. Mavia sighed heavily and told the maid that she should know that in this world, there were people who understood everything in a good way, and there were also those who obeyed, even for a short time, only after they were shown who was in charge. Mavia sighed heavily and asked her maid what category she thought Gilbert belonged to. She knew that he certainly belonged to the second category, but that was not what she was worried about. Sarah looked at her mistress with alarm and asked how she could be sure that the product did not have any side effects. The young lady, in turn, did not answer. She knew that if she took the monster's blood more than once, side effects could not be avoided. She had also thought about this for a long time, but she wanted him to understand everything properly, so she simply had no choice. She wanted him to know who the throne dared. After taking the potion, the young lady hurried to her husband's room. He looked at his wife in surprise when he saw that she had sneaked into his room through the window. She smiled and said that he should get up quickly. Mavia looked at him with a satisfied smile and said that they needed to finish before the medicine wore off. The man, burning with rage and anger, shouted at his subordinates to shut their mouths. He was angry because they asked for a reward when they could not properly complete the task. He shouted with fury that they were worse than cattle. He did not understand how they dared to run away from their owner. At the same time, the spouses closely watched this situation. Mavia looked into the distance with a smirk and said that looking at this, she thought that she was really a good boss. She smiled and asked her husband if he thought so too. The Duke was taken aback for a moment because he was thinking about what to answer her. Mavia was taken aback and asked her husband in confusion why he was not answering her question. He sighed heavily and said that it was probably time for them to go down. A moment later, he extended his hand to her, but the young lady only puffed out her beautiful cheeks and looked intently at her husband. Edith looked at his wife with a gentle smile and asked her to be careful. She smiled and said that she would return to him soon. A moment later, he used his magic, and she disappeared before him. Mavia came down in a flash and approached the young man, and she did not forget to greet him. The Baron was shocked because he did not understand what she was doing in such a place, but he called her by name. Mavia smiled and asked who he was talking about, since she didn't know the name he had called her by. He was in shock, didn't understand what it even meant. He shouted that if she came to him because of the recent incident, then he was simply following Gilbert's instructions. He shouted that no harm had been done to her in any case. Mavia smiled and said that it was so. She looked closely at the young man and said that he should have come to her after all. She looked at him intently and said with a satisfied grin that the rumors that he had been beaten by a maid were too humiliating. The Baron was shocked. He did not understand where the young lady got such strength from. A moment later, the young people looked with bewilderment and fear at the young lady, who was beating the young man because she did it with cruelty. Mavia looked closely at the young man she had just beaten. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the young people and asked with a smile if they had seen everything. They were taken aback and shouted that they had seen nothing at all. She sighed heavily and said that it was too bad that they hadn't seen anything, so they should see right now how their boss was being beaten by one weak maid. She looked at them with a fierce grin and asked who she was. Out of fear, they all said in one voice that she was just a maid. She smiled and said that everything was correct. Some time later, the Duke appeared in front of her and asked if she was finished. Mavia smiled and said that she was almost finished with everything. Mavia looked at the young man with a smile and said that everything was finished faster than she thought. The Duke smiled, looking at his wife, and said that in that case, they should leave, since they had something left that she should like. Mavia looked at him in surprise, since she did not understand what he was talking about. Some time later, the young men led their boss and asked him to be patient for a little while as he writhed in pain. Gilbert came closer to them and quietly asked his friend why he did not follow his instructions. Bronn was furious. He shouted and insulted his friend. Gilbert looked at him sharply and told him to answer and ask him again why he did not follow his instructions. Baron looked at him with fury and shouted at him not to order him around. The Baron was very angry because he knew that Gilbert had actually forgotten about the matter since he was only running after that woman. He shouted that in that case, it would be better to kill her. Gilbert froze in shock on the spot since he did not expect to hear such a thing. Mavia looked at their son with a smile as she realized that he had gone out while they were gone. The Duke told his wife that she had better return home. She was surprised as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke said that he would escort her to the mansion and she should go to bed first. She smiled and asked what about him. Edith looked at her son with cold fury and said that he would finish here and come to her. The young lady in turn realized that today her husband's hands would be covered in blood. She saw his thirst for murder. A few days later, Gilbert sighed heavily and looking into the distance, asked his subordinate what was happening in the main building. Because I saw that it was very noisy there from the very morning. The young man smiled and said that today the ducal couple would visit the Marquis's mansion. Gilbert was surprised. The young man looked at Gilbert with a smile and said that Her Highness the Duchess had asked him to convey something to him. Gilbert was shocked and shouted at his servant to throw away all the food immediately. He saw a note in which the Grand Duchess wrote that heaven punishes people for being picky about food. Mavia looked at her new hairstyle with surprise and said that it was similar to the one her faithful servant did for her. Edith looked away and said that perhaps he was just lucky. The night before, he had asked Sarah to show him how to braid his hair. She showed him all the hairstyles shakings. Mavia looked at her husband in bewilderment. But a moment later, she said it was very suspicious. Some time later, the Marquis and his wife thanked the young lady, her husband, for coming to them. The Duke greeted them and said that he was glad to officially meet them. Mavia smiled and asked her parents how they were doing. The Marquis said with a smile that everything was fine, and he was also glad that they had arrived safe and sound. Madame told the young people that they had already prepared everything so they could go straight to the table. Mavia was glad of this news because she alone wanted the city to be here as soon as possible. But a moment later, she looked at her parents in bewilderment. Mavia was a little worried because she didn't understand what was wrong with her parents. Sometime later, they were all sitting at the festive table, but the atmosphere was not the best. Mavia looked closely at her parents as she knew that everything was somehow awkward. She knew that her husband had not been particularly talkative before, but she was struck by the fact that even her parents remained silent. She understood that they still felt uneasy because of the Grand Duke. Edith. He called his wife dear. A moment later, he said that one must eat everything in order to live this life for a long time. She looked in surprise at the potatoes that he put on her plate. She remembered the moment when Sarah shouted that her mistress did not like sweet potatoes, cucumbers, onions, and potatoes, and if someone ever tried to poison her, then she should avoid dishes with these ingredients. She looked at her bitch cat intently, as she knew that he was well aware that she did not eat such things. He looked at her intently and put more vegetables on her plate, but she stopped him and said that if he even tried to put such food on her plate, she would immediately file for divorce. The Marquis looked at them intently and asked if they were really going away this weekend. Mevia looked intently at her father and said that they were. She sighed heavily as she realized that thanks to the Duke speaking up, her parents had finally brought up the topic. Madame, looking at her daughter, said that the lady from Elaine's house was looking for a meeting with her, and before leaving, it was worth talking to her. Mevia looked closely at her mother and realized that if she was talking about something like that, it meant that Monica had come to them more than once. Madame told her daughter to try to be friendly towards her because she loved her very much. Mevia sighed and said that for some reason, she didn't feel it at all. Mevia knew that last time Monica, after all, had also complained to Gilbert from behind her. However then, Gilbert had made such a scandal that they didn't have time to talk normally. Mevia wondered if history could still turn out differently. She sighed heavily and said that she would meet with her. Bowing, the Marquis told the Duke that he entrusted his daughter to him. The Marquis told his son-in-law that he would not hide it. Before they were worried, they heard various rumors about him, but now he saw that the rumors did not convey what kind of person he really was. Trembling with fear, the Marquis said that he believed that the Duke would always protect his daughter. After some time, they were silent, heading to the estate. Mevia looked closely at her husband, because he had previously said that he had even met with the first head of the family. Mevia clearly understood that he had lived for at least 500 years, but she was puzzled because she did not accept why he was still not married. Because she understood that even if you look at it objectively, her husband was simply a treasure. Maevia's wife asked if this was really his true character. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. She said that he was considerate and kind, and that he had been like that from the very beginning. Edith looked intently at his wife and said that she was the only one who thought so highly of him. The lady looked away from him, embarrassed, and said that the others didn't know him well. Mevia understood that even just looking at her hair could tell a lot. She knew that even the Sari had a hard time taking care of her hair at first, but he had achieved this result in just a few attempts. He looked at her with a smile and asked what she especially liked. He wanted to know this for the future. She smiled and said that she liked to see him so bright. Mevia looked closely at her husband and said that she understood that one cannot always remain bright. Mevia gave him a radiant smile and said that sometimes he should smile with all his heart, and she in turn would try to be there to bring him joy. The next day, their carriage set off north, and the journey was not an easy one. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked her to open her mouth wider. Mevia looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not understand what he was doing at all. She smiled and asked if they weren't playing doctor. Edith said that they don't know what side effects might come from the blood of the magical beast that she drank. She looked away from him with embarrassment and said that he didn't need to worry since Sarah had checked everything thoroughly last night. She sighed heavily and asked her to sit next to her. Mevia looked closely at her husband and asked with a smile if he was going to use teleportation. He smiled and said that he would like to show her something. Sometime later, Mevia froze for a moment as she was struck by the beauty. She couldn't take her eyes off this beauty and simply admired it. The Duke looked at his wife and said with a smile that when he was traveling to the capital, they passed this way, and he remembered this view. He knew that in the northern lands, such beauty cannot be found very often, so he wanted her to see it too. She knew that he always remained inscrutable. The only facial expression he sometimes allowed himself was contempt or displeasure. Everyone saw only negative emotions. She knew that he was not hungry from the beginning. He just lost his smile because of someone. She was furious, wondering who did this to the other Duke. When the heroine of the novel, Mevia, arrived in the north alone after her wedding with Gilbert, a huge fire was raging in the north. The reason was that the main character of the novel, Rayhan, ran away from home and accidentally removed the seal from a powerful monster, after which the young man completely changed due to feelings of guilt. Sometime later, they finally reached the north. Looking out the window, the young lady saw people who were happy and talking to each other. She saw children having fun. Looking at everyone, she felt relieved, because judging by the fact that the village was in order, they managed to get there on time. A moment later, Mevia turned her gaze to her husband and called out to him. She called him again, as she saw that he did not answer her. Mevia looked at her husband in confusion, as he simply stared out the window in silence. Mevia looked at Edith in surprise and asked what he was so lost in thought that he didn't answer. He sighed heavily and said that he was overcome by doubts about whether it was right to bring his wife to such a place. She sighed heavily and looked back, but did not answer him. A moment later, she said with a smile that she had never seen such a terrible building. She clearly saw the residence of the Grand Duke in front of her. Mevia sighed heavily and asked with a smile if an indirect monster had really appeared and doused the castle with water. The Duke smiled as he looked at the castle, but did not answer her. But after a few seconds, He said that he could not promise that it would be better inside, so he did not know how to console her. Sometime later, they were walking to the castle. She was glad that they returned before the north burned, but she was still puzzled because no one had told her that it would be so cold in the north. The Duke, supporting his wife, said that in a little while they would get inside, and there she would be able to warm up. Mavia was momentarily perplexed when she saw the cat. Mavia was very surprised as a whole crowd of cats rushed towards her. She looked at her husband in surprise and asked if the second young gentleman really liked cats. Edith looked at the cats in surprise and said that it was unlikely. She asked in surprise if these were all his animals. Edith sighed heavily and said that he would not keep such a clumsy creature even if it were given to him as a gift. A moment later, they saw the young gentleman. Rayhan looked at the Grand Duchess with a joyful smile and introduced himself, saying that he was looking forward to the day when he could meet her. Rayhan looked away and said that he had many shortcomings, but he would try hard, so he hoped that she would be lenient towards him. Mavia froze in surprise and wondered if he really had such a character. After all, she remembered from the novel she had read that he was a restless, energetic child. Mavia looked at the boy with a smile and wondered if he was just pretending, as she knew it was very sweet of him. A moment later, she came closer to him and said with a smile that she was pleased to meet him. Mavia smiled and said that she was also counting on his support. But at that very moment, Gilbert entered the room and sent his brother. Rayhan looked at his brother with a joyful smile as he called his name, but Gilbert looked at his brother intently and said that the Grand Duchess was an enemy of their family. Rayhan looked at his brother in bewilderment as he did not understand what he was talking about. Gilbert looked back coldly and said that he should never trust her. The Grand Duchess was shocked as she did not expect such a setup from the young man. The Duke looked at his son with anger and said that he had no tact at all and asked him if he still lacked education. A moment later, Gilbert shouted that he had a sudden stomachache and needed to leave, but the lady looked after him in surprise, not understanding where he got the courage to behave like that in front of Edis. Rayhan, trembling with fear, looked closely at the Grand Duchess and asked if what her elder brother had just said was really true. She looked at the young master intently and said with a smile that he didn't need to worry, because if she really were an enemy, then she wouldn't have brought a neatly folded Gilbert. The boy was very frightened by her words, and taken aback, he hid behind his father's back. Edith looked closely at his wife and asked if she was really one of those people that children were afraid of. Mavia didn't understand what to do when her children avoided her even in her life in question. Her original goal was to spend the money accumulated from investments and throw wild parties on Gilbert's corpse, or help Rayhan grow up without injuries. Mavia was puzzled because she knew that if things went this way, she would never be able to make friends with the children. Mavia looked at her maid with a joyful smile and asked if she had forgotten about the gift because she wanted to give the young master a gift during dinner. Sarah was taken aback and looked at the lady in surprise and also asked if she was sure that it was possible to give this gift in such a form. Maevia was surprised and did not understand why her maid said such a thing, since she knew that everyone liked such a gift. Sarah, looking away from her mistress, said that it was so. She knew that the gift was not the main thing, but the main thing was the intention. After a while, Rayhan met his father in the dining room and asked with a smile if he would really eat with them. The Duke looked at the boy intently and said that today it would be so. A moment later, the Duke told his butler not to add onions to one of the soups. Rayhan looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he had really fallen out of love with onions. The Duke smiled tenderly and said that this was not so, and he also asked the boy if everything was all right with him. Rayhan said with a smile that of course he was fine, and his nanny had a slight cold, but she quickly recovered since he himself brought her medicine, and the nanny was very happy. He joyfully said that he had grown up and his blanket had become too small. Rayhan looked at the Duke and asked if his older brother would join the dinner. The Duke sighed heavily and said that the young man knew the value of his life, so he would not come. Rayhan looked at his father in bewilderment, but said nothing. Edith looked at the boy intently and said that the Grand Duchess was not one to forgive. Easily, Rayhan was shocked. He did not understand what his words meant. He wondered if the Duke had just said that the Grand Duchess was stronger than his brother, the fencing genius. He was shocked because he didn't know how to react to such words. But a moment later, the Grand Duchess entered the room and with a smile asked if she was too late. She smiled and said that, as an apology, she had prepared a gift. A few hours before Mavia ruined everything, a little boy wondered with warm hope what the Grand Duchess was really like, because he wanted to get to know her as soon as possible, because he hoped that she would like him. Rayhan was taken aback, as he was glad that she had given him a gift, but at the same moment, he was very worried. The Duchess looked at the boy tenderly and said that he could open it right now. He was very scared because he knew that it was still a gift from the Grand Duchess. When he opened the gift, he froze in place from surprise and shock. He did not understand what it was in front of him because everything looked very ominous. With tears in his eyes, he wondered if the Grand Duchess had taken a dislike to him. He was taken aback because he did not know where he had made a mistake. He realized that it would have been better if he had been given the opportunity to at least ask for forgiveness. The Duke looked at the boy in surprise and asked what had happened. He wanted to know if there was something wrong with the gift. The boy said that he had been given a precious stone, and the Duke asked in surprise if he had really received a diamond as a gift. The Duchess smiled and said that it was not just any diamond, but a black diamond weighing a whopping 45 carats. Looking at his wife, the Duke asked how long it had been since she had last spoken with the children. Manhwa was taken aback and said that some time had passed. She smiled and said that they should trust her taste because this black diamond was valuable in itself like a jewel, and it would definitely be useful to them in the future. She looked closely at the young man and asked if he felt her sincerity, since she even wrote the letter by hand. She smiled and said that she just wanted him to know that she wanted to get closer to him. The young man was taken aback and thanked her, and also said that he would take care of it. She smiled and said that she was very glad that he liked the gift. He in turn really hoped that he would not bring a curse if he touched it. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they might as well eat first, before the food got cold. Rayhan glanced sideways at his gift, as he didn't know where she had found such an ominous thing. He was taken aback, and wondered if what he had heard before was really true. Some time ago, he ran in a hurry after his brother, and called him Gilbert, looked at his brother with cold fury, and asked what he wanted. Rayhan looked at his brother with concern, and asked what he meant when he said that the Duchess was their enemy. Gilbert angrily asked his brother if he really doubted his words. The boy was in shock. A moment later, Procyon approached them, and looking at Gilbert, said that he should not introduce unnecessary doubts into the head of the younger gentleman. Procyon smiled and told the young gentleman that all the talk about the Duchess being an enemy of the family was nonsense. Even though her ladyship was not particularly kind and not particularly affectionate, she was still good. He smiled a radiant smile and said that she was very beautiful, and even the proudest aristocrats of the capital unanimously recognized her as the most outstanding beauty. And besides her beautiful appearance, she had enormous wealth earned through unofficial channels. The young gentleman looked at the knight in surprise and asked what unofficial channels he was talking about, and the knight was taken aback and realized that he had made a mistake. He said with a smile that it was just a rumor, so he said with a beaming smile that the Duchess was special. He looked closely at the Duchess because he understood that she could destroy his brother at any moment, which is why sinister things came so easily to her. She smiled at him tenderly, and he flinched in surprise. A moment later, Rayhan sighed heavily and asked if he could leave early as he had a sharp pain in his stomach. The Duchess stood up in a hurry and told the boy that she had noticed that he was not feeling well, so she wanted to see him off. Looking at the butler, she asked him to bring something for the young master's stomach to the bedroom, and she also asked him to ask the nanny if he had any chronic illnesses. Rayhan looked at his father with tears in his eyes and called him. The Duke said that his wife does everything with the purest intentions. Manhwa looked at the young master with a smile and said that it was time for them to go. She also said with a smile that she would take care of him and that he did not need to worry. He was a jockey and wondered if she really treated him like this with pure intentions. Looking at the Duchess, he did not understand where exactly her pure intentions were, as she looked at him ominously. Sometime later, they came to his bedroom. Manhwa smiled and asked if she could leave the gift in the room. He said that she could leave it. A moment later, she greeted them. The young master was surprised and did not understand why the cat was in his room. He hurriedly told her to go straight to her room. Manhwa looked at the cat with a smile and said that the young master needed to rest, so she should go to her place while she stroked her affectionately. The boy was surprised because he knew that the cat could usually scratch the one who touched her. He was shocked as he saw that the cat calmly pressed herself against the Grand Duchess and even purred, hugging her. He was shocked by such a sight. Manhwa sighed heavily, looking at the cat, and said that it was time for her to go to her room. Manhwa, looking at the young man, asked if they left the cat in the hallway, would she return to her room on her own? He smiled and said that the maid who took care of the cats would take her back. She looked at the boy in surprise and asked if the maid had really come up with the names for the cats. He said that the Count had given them the names. She was surprised that the cats had exquisite names and each had its own room. Rayhan looked intently at the Duchess and said that she was tired, so she could quickly return to her room, and he would just lie quietly in bed. When the nanny brought the medicine, he would take it. She smiled and said that in that case, she would stay with him until he went to bed. He sighed heavily and said that she shouldn't do something like that, but she only looked at him affectionately and called out. She looked closely at the little boy and said that she really didn't know much about children, as she had had little opportunity to get close to them. Manhwa said with a smile that maybe she wouldn't be of much use, but at least she would stay by his side until the nanny arrived. Manhwa looked at the little boy with a gentle smile and asked if it would really bother him that much. He was taken aback, as he was blinded by her smile, and said that it would not bother him at all. He sighed heavily and said hastily that he felt like he was bothering her too much. She smiled and said that everything was fine, and that he could go to bed soon. A moment later, he looked at the Grand Duchess with embarrassment and called her. He smiled and asked if he could ask her something. Mavia said tenderly that of course he could ask anything. Rayhan looked at the Grand Duchess with a smile and asked how she met his father, because he knew that his father very rarely left the house. She smiled and said that they first met in the imperial palace. He came to punish the man who was going to harm her. She knew that if she was telling the child about their meeting, she had to tell everything in general terms. Mavia looked at the boy with a smile and asked if he had any more questions. He looked at her closely and asked sheepishly if his father would come tomorrow too. She smiled and said that she would organize a meeting, but for this he needed to get better. He smiled and asked if this was really true, and at that very moment he shouted that he already felt great. She sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry, because she would have liked to read him a story, but he shouted that she would do it next time. She smiled and said goodbye to him. He sighed heavily as he was glad that she had finally left. Teresa looked closely at the young gentleman and said that she heard that he was not feeling well, so she brought him some medicine. He smiled and said that he was already fine since his problem was solved. Rayhan understood perfectly well that the Duchess was truly an amazing person because everyone worshipped and feared their father, but she was not afraid at all. Most likely, it was because she was so strong that she could crush even his brother. He knew that she also controlled the shadow world of the capital. This scared him, even though the gift she gave him also looked quite ominous, but the care she showed seemed genuine to him. He felt something warm tickling in his chest, and it was the first time he had such a feeling. He was still scared, but he supposed that he shouldn't have avoided her. The Duchess walked slowly back to the dining room, noting that the outside of the castle did not look very well maintained, but the inside of the castle was in better condition than she had expected, although she knew that some touch-ups would still be useful. A moment later, she stopped near a small statue of a cat, and sighed heavily as she realized that cats were loved in the castle more than people. A moment later, she walked leisurely into the Duke's room, and she looked around carefully, because she noticed that there were no decorations in the room, namely, no cat statues. It was gloomy, but overall, quite decent. A moment later, she noticed the Duke on the sofa. He looked at her with a smile and asked if the examination was finished. She smiled and said that for now, she was finished with the examination. He asked with a smile if he had passed the exam. She smiled and said that he had more or less passed. Maivia sat down next to her husband with lightning speed and said that this was their first meeting after a week of separation. She asked if he missed her. The Duke looked at her sideways, but did not answer. She sighed heavily, because she had made a joke and received silence in response, and because of this, she felt awkward. She wondered if they really had problems. Maivia said, with a smile, that he had previously said that due to the peculiarities of their bodies, they would not be able to have children. She looked at him intently and asked if it was not entirely impossible. He looked at her in bewilderment and said that it was. Edith looked at his wife intently and asked if she knew that she was speaking ambiguously. She looked at him in bewilderment. She asked in surprise if there was something wrong with her gaze. Edith sighed heavily and said that he would never have thought that he would say something like that in his life. But still, he asked her to look into his eyes. She was taken aback and said with embarrassment that she herself did not know why she did this, since unfortunately, she did not hide her curiosity well, but still she had no evil intentions. She sighed heavily and said that she was too tired today and therefore went to bed. The Duke said that he needed to finish something. She smiled and said, as she left, that he should not overwork himself, since such a beautiful face should remain in order. He embarrassed looked away from her and agreed. Mavia Yan thought that she was really very tired, and she had the feeling that she would instantly fall asleep. Looking at her husband, she knew that he looked like a real villain, but he was incredibly beautiful, like the Lord of Darkness. She knew that if a hero were to pass by and think that he was the Lord of Darkness, plotting something sinister, and would try to destroy him, no one would be able to object. However, she knew that he would not allow himself to be defeated. She sighed heavily, because she knew that he was really very handsome. But she also knew that he was lazy, and that was his only flaw. But she couldn't do anything about it, because she knew that she would have to take care of him. In the morning, when the Grand Duchess woke up, she saw very sad snow outside the window. But she knew that, for the north, this was a mere trifle. She learned that the Count had expressed a desire to meet with her. And having learned of this, the Duke also went to her office. She smiled and asked if he was being too active, since he had even met with her. The Duke said that if his wife deigned to take care of him, he should at least be worthy of her efforts, even if he was lazy. But one cannot just accept her care without giving anything in return. A moment later, they were informed that the Count had arrived. Mavia knew that she would finally meet the man who had turned the Grand Duchy into a complete cat's nest. She was very interested in what he looked like. A moment later, an Agraf entered their office and greeted them. He said with a smile that his name was Taliman Elliot, and that he was responsible for managing the lands. Smiling, he said that he was a loyal servant of the Duke's house, and therefore was ready to give his life for this family, so he asked them to use him as they wished. She was shocked, because he didn't look like she imagined him at all, instead of an ordinary cat. She saw a lion or a tiger. She saw tanned, shiny skin, as if he wasn't working on the estate, but was relaxing at a resort. She understood that she should leave the cats aside, and wondered how he managed the treasury at all. The Duchess greeted the Count with a smile, and asked how things were going under his management. She asked if there were any who, taking advantage of the master's absence, were quietly enriching themselves or relaxing at the government's expense. He smiled and said that everything was going more or less smoothly. He said that there were those who were moderately greedy, but those who crossed the line, he simply eliminated without hesitation. She was shocked, wondering if he really eliminated them without hesitation. She was worried that he could accidentally pocket money along with them. The Duke looked at the man closely and asked his wife if he didn't look like the kind of man who was willing to kill even his own parents. He told his wife that he had dealt with such matters himself, so she didn't need to worry. Tallyman Elliot smiled and asked in this regard whether it would be possible in future to submit reports on management matters directly to the Duchess's desk, since the Duke had not even glanced at his detailed reports, which he had compiled with all his heart. Tallyman Elliot said with a smile that the Duchess was after all the heroine who had saved the North, and therefore, after the traditional ceremony was completed, he wanted to give an official report. She smiled and said that she too would hope for his assistance in the future. The Duchess looked at the man intently and said that he could now leave, and she also asked that all the cats be taken from the castle. He was shocked and asked if she was really talking about fairies now. He shouted that they were like a part of his soul, and if she drove them away, she would drive him away too. The Duke looked at the man closely, and without flinching, said that he had served well, and his salary would be paid next month. The Duchess asked why they kept cats in the Duke's castle at all. He sighed heavily and said that they told him that they were comfortable in the castle. She asked him in surprise if he had really spoken to them personally. The Count had said that they brought good luck to the castle. She could not resist and asked if it would not fall like ice without this. He was taken aback and said that she had misunderstood everything. Tallyman Elliot, with tears in his eyes, looked at the Duke and asked him for mercy. He said that if they left the fairies, he would do anything. She smiled and asked if it was true. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that first, he should clean up all the cat trinkets scattered around the castle. She said that she thought he didn't need to explain anything because he already understood what was being discussed. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. The Duke looked closely at the man and said that, judging by his expression, he was still not himself, so he could not just let him go, and perhaps he wanted to take one of his limbs for himself. The Count was taken aback and shouted that he was fine. The Duchess told the Count to look into what she had told him, and then he would report everything to her. She asked how long she would have to wait. Bowing, he shouted that he would take care of the matter that very minute. Mavia looked at the man closely and told her husband that they could let him go. The Duke sighed heavily and said that if his wife wished it, then he would do so. As he left, the man thanked the ducal couple and said that with their permission, he would take on the task entrusted to him. Mavia looked closely at the Count as she realized that he was not only stubborn, but she saw that her husband was not so much against sweet stubbornness. She realized that, judging by the document, the Count had a lot of work. Mavia wondered if he was the same nameless assistant who had feces in the novel sometimes. Mavia knew that this meeting went well, and so she wanted to see how it would go further. She did not want to drive the cats away, since they would be useful for the young master. She knew she had made it clear to him that she was not to be trifled with, and that he would now be more careful. A moment later, the Duke spoke to his wife about the ceremony. He sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness, as he should have explained everything to her in advance. But since the Duchess had not been in the house for a long time, he completely forgot about this ceremony. Mavia said that she understood everything, and also asked what kind of ceremony it was. He said that everything was simple, and on the night when the moon rose, you needed to climb the first tower. He didn't have time to finish speaking before the young lady covered his mouth with her palms and asked him to wait a little. Mavia looked at the Duke with a smile and said that she would better clarify all the details with the second young gentleman. She smiled and asked if it would be possible to bring him to them for a few minutes later. The Duke froze in embarrassment and told his wife that she could do as she wanted. Some time later, Mavia met with the young master and apologized for disturbing him, but in reality, she needed his help. She smiled and asked if he could help her. He was surprised as he did not expect such a thing. She smiled and said that she heard that she needed to go through the traditional ceremony in the first tower, but she didn't know anything about it, so she would feel better if he gave her advice. So she came to him. Rayhan stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to answer. But after a few seconds, he said that he heard that a spirit lived in that tower, and legends said that the first great duke sealed it. The Duchess smiled and said that it was a very mysterious story, so she asked if she could come closer to him to hear him better. He smiled and agreed with her. However, a moment later, he shouted that he had heard something about the blood of the family. The Duchess was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. He looked at her closely and said that it most likely had something to do with the blood of their family. She smiled and said that she thought so too. Mavia looked at the young gentleman with a gentle smile and thanked him for explaining everything to her so clearly. She was glad because she knew that she had done the right thing when she approached him. The young gentleman, in turn, was very embarrassed after her words and said that he was very glad that he helped her. She looked at him with admiration because she knew that he was just a cutie. Mavia looked at the young master closely and said that she was going to have tea with the Duke soon, so she asked if he would join them, since as far as she knew, he still had classes. But if he had free time, she would like to see him. He asked in surprise if he could really join. She smiled and said that she would wait for him while he got ready and changed his clothes. Rayan said with a joyful smile that he would do everything quickly. Mayavia looked closely at the boy, and since she saw that he was a very sincere, bright child, but she knew that he, unfortunately, would change dramatically in a month. She understood that they needed to create happy memories so that he would not even have thoughts of running away. She knew that, as an adoptive mother, she had to win his trust. She wanted to protect him from his older brother's violence, and she also wanted to show him the Grand Duke's face more often. She knew she had to do the right thing to keep him pure and innocent. At the moment when she thought about such a thing, he appeared in a losing form, the glitter of gold jewelry, artfully styled hair. One glance was enough to understand the depth of his feelings for the great Northern Duke. He seemed sincere and enjoyed drinking tea with the Duke, and then his childish spontaneity finally appeared. Even the look with which he looked at the Duchess lost its former wariness. After some time, the head butler took the young man to his next lesson. Edith looked closely at his wife and asked with a smile if she had listened to Rayhan's story about the spirits. She smiled and said that she had listened carefully to everything. She also said that the spirits sealed by the first Duke were unwittingly serving the house, bringing blessings, and the reason why only the Duchess was participating in the ceremony was a little unclear. She asked the Duke if they could take revenge on the descendants of the one who imprisoned them. She said that the weather today is not very good, but since they took on the matter, it is better to finish it quickly. Mavia looked at her husband with a smile and asked if she offered to go with him, would he accompany her? The Duke sighed heavily and said that of course he would go with her, since she always remembered to accompany him on every outing, and he didn't even know whether to thank her for it or not. Mavia looked at her husband and asked if he would join her if she later offered to inspect the property. The Duke frowned for a moment. He smiled and said that it would not be difficult to accompany her, but he was still curious about the role she had assigned him. She smiled and said that he was her bodyguard protector and personal hairdresser. Long ago, magical beasts were called demons, for any pact made with their blood invariably led to human death. But the one that came to Mavius was different. Even if the treaty was broken, it did not demand life, but only fleeting torment. Of course, the curse of the ban still lay on him, but if she knew about it, she wouldn't care. Edith sighed heavily and told his wife that she had better return to her chambers, as he still had his own business to sort out. She sighed heavily and asked if her presence bothered him. He wondered if this was some kind of mad audacity, a consequence of the blood of a magical beast. She said that in a foreign land, he was the only son she could talk to and rely on, but still he asked her to leave. He was shocked, wondering if she was so sure that he would not harm her. A moment later, she showed him an unusual flower and said with a smile that it was blue and white, just like her husband. He sighed heavily and said that he did not know the name of the flower, and in general, he did not understand what the flower had to do with it. He was surprised, and at the same time about the task, since he did not understand why she chose him. He knew that she had even refused the crown prince since he had broken off his engagement for her. Edith wondered what was hidden behind the beautiful appearance. He looked at her intently because he understood that, until he understood the reason, he would go to the end. He hoped that he would not meet him on this path. Sometime later, they finally left the warm castle for the cold street. Mavia, shivering from the cold, said that it seemed that she had not chosen the best day, so she suggested that they postpone their journeys and go when it gets warmer, in 100 years. The Duke smiled and said that they only had a few minutes' walk to the tower, and also said that she still needed to explore the estate, so he asked if she was giving up too soon. She asked if he could use teleportation. He sighed heavily and said that if she didn't mind, he would go first. She was shocked and screamed that this was not the case at all, and asked her if he would leave her alone. Mavia was puzzled because she knew that it was very warm in the castle. She looked tenderly out the window and enjoyed the snow, but now that she was outside, she wanted to quickly return to my warm castle. She didn't want to experience the splendor of the temperature spells in this way. She sighed heavily, as she knew it was very good that the tower was close, but she was shocked when she saw that her husband had abandoned her again. Some time later, she entered the tower and shouted with displeasure that he was simply a traitor. She sighed heavily and said that you should have written frostbite in the marriage contract, not burns. She screamed at her husband, who almost turned into an icicle. The Duke sighed heavily and looked tenderly at his wife. A moment later, he handed her a small, beautiful stone. Maivia looked at him in surprise and asked what he had given her. He smiled and said that it was not under the contract, of course, but that she should consider it compensation for the treatment. Maivia said with a satisfied smile that she did not understand what it was, but still she felt warm, and her body was literally melting. She was shocked because even by such a small fire, she felt very energetic. He smiled and said that it was all the influence of local spirits. Maivia looked closely at her husband and asked if they were saying that there were spirits here. Maivia asked her husband if she could make a personal wish if they found the statue where the spirit was sealed. He smiled and asked if anyone could forbid her from doing something like this. He said that it was just an ancient superstition. She was in shock. She didn't know how to make a wish because she didn't know where the spirit was sealed. She saw that there were many statues around. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked if the young master hadn't told her that there was only one spirit imprisoned in the tower. She was shocked and didn't understand what that even meant. He smiled and said that she could check for herself whether it was true or not. She was furious because his grin screamed without words that he was right. Maivia wondered if this didn't disrupt the spirit's life form. Now she understood why the previous heads of the family didn't even approach the tower, because it was all because of what their predecessors had done, and now they cowardly sent only duchesses. Maivia told her husband that they couldn't return earlier, because she wanted to quickly make a wish, and then they would go. She knew perfectly well that she needed to think positively, although now she understood that she would not have to whisper dreams and empty statues. She wanted to choose anyone, and make a wish, and then return later. A moment later, she looked at the ground in bewilderment. As she saw a statue, Maivia asked, was it really thrown to the ground on purpose to break it? She saw that just a little more, and the statue would have crumbled into pieces. But looking at the statue, it seemed to her that its eyes were alive. Maivia? I sighed heavily and asked her husband what would happen to the spirit if the statue were completely destroyed. The Duke said that most likely it would disappear. She looked closely at the small statue and said that in such a case, she would choose it. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was confident in her choice. She sighed heavily and said that she was sure since this statue almost fell apart. She sighed heavily because she knew that if they put the statue upright, it would fall apart completely. Therefore, she wanted to make a wish on the spot. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she tied a ribbon to the statue. She smiled and said that it was a gesture of goodwill since she did not bring money. Maivia said with a smile that gifts were usually chosen based on the tastes of the one to whom the gift was given. But still now she saw that her cute bow looked very beautiful and hoped that the spirit would like her gift. She said with a smile that she would now make a wish and passed the small flame to her husband. Maivia. She smiled and said, Lord Soul, that you sealed him in such a backwater, and this is already a humiliation. And at the same time, he still distributed a blessing, and this was very difficult. Listening to her, the Duke looked at his wife with a smile and asked if she was making a wish or lecturing. Maivia looked at him with bewilderment and asked what he was talking about since she was simply teaching the obvious. She smiled and said that her wish was simple because she wanted to become a little richer. She wanted all the gold and diamonds of the empire to be hers, and she also wanted power and glory to the ends of the continent and a new religion where she would be glorified as a saint. She said that if he fulfilled her wish, then she would take care of his well-being and even the statue would be repaired. She smiled and said that even if something irreversible happened during the renovation, he shouldn't worry as she would keep him in her heart forever. She said that he would just be doing his job, but he would become special to her. With tears in her eyes, she asked about the deal. The Duke sighed heavily, and with an innocent smile, said that her words were simply amazing, since it was a desire on her part, and at the same time manipulation. She looked at her husband with a playful smile, and said that if she was going to take a risk, she should take a big one. After all, she knew that it was just superstition and nothing would work out for her. He smiled and asked if she didn't care about world peace. The Duchess said that it wasn't for horses. He smiled and said that they could narrow it to the north. Maivia said, with a satisfied smile, that she trusted her husband, the master of the north. He looked at her closely and asked, what about the prosperity of her house, since he had heard that the House of Morgan had declared her heir. Maivia sighed heavily and said that the side branches were also sharpening their knives. The same ones who told her to simply sign the marriage contract, saying that the head of the clan should be a man. She was furious, for she knew that now that she was in the north, they were openly demanding that a new heir be chosen, but her parents were merely amused. She looked at her husband intently and said that she had not at all thought that the conversation would go in such a boring direction, and therefore she invited him to return. The Duke looked at her intently, but did not answer. She looked at him with bewilderment as she saw that he was worried about something. So she smiled and asked if he wanted to look around the tower some more. Maevia told her husband that she thought he was rushing to the type faster. He sighed heavily and said that there was no need for that. Maevia, with a smile, hurried him because she wanted to drink cocoa. He smiled and agreed. Maevia looked closely at her husband as she realized that whenever they spoke about spirits, his face became more serious than usual. She wondered if he had actually fought a spirit several hundred years ago. Maevia, looking at her husband, she clearly understood that no matter what expression he had on his face, he still looked impressive. Edith looked at his wife and said that she had stopped, so he asked if she wanted to stop for a little while longer. She was taken aback and said that it wasn't so, because she just thought she heard something. He told her not to pay attention, because it was probably just some nonsense. But at the same time, the dragon spirit cursed all people, as he intended to regain his powers and deal with them. Maevia looked at the young gentleman with a joyful smile and said that last time he helped her a lot. And thanks to him, everything went simply and wonderfully. He looked away from her, embarrassed, and said that he was very glad that he had been able to help her. She smiled and said that since she had received an explanation from him, everything went smoothly. So she asked if next time she had a question, could she come to him to get an answer. He smiled and said that, of course, he would tell her everything if he knew. A moment later, the butler informed the young master that his lesson would soon begin. Maevia looked at the young gentleman, smiled, and said that she would accompany him. He was surprised and said that she did not have to do this, but the Duchess said that since she had been sitting for a long time, her legs were numb. He smiled and agreed. Maevia looked at the young master with a smile and said that there was an old shabby stone statue in the tower, and she thought that there was a dragon, but the Duke said that this article was a gargoyle. To her, Rehan smiled and asked if she thought that gargoyles and dragons were quite similar. She smiled and said that she probably was right. Maevia said that she tied a ribbon on the statue's tail. He smiled and said that he could imagine that the spirit would definitely like her sweet gift. In turn, the young man wondered if she had really thought back then that she would like the gift she had given him earlier. The Duchess smiled and said that she had not noticed how time had flown at all, since most likely it was because they had been talking all the way. He smiled and said that he too had enjoyed talking to her. Maevia looked closely at the young man and asked if he would continue to come to her just to chat. He smiled and said that he would definitely come to her. She asked with a smile if he would help her, if she needed advice. Rehan gave the Duchess his radiant smile and said that he would certainly help her. The Duchess looked closely at the young man and said that if he also had any worries, he should tell her about them, because she also wanted to be useful to him, and she also said with a smile that he should definitely tell her if he suddenly wanted to run away from home. He froze in place in surprise. She smiled and said that if he ever wanted to run away from home, or if he had a similar desire, he should definitely tell her. The young man was taken aback, but still agreed with her. The Duchess looked at the boy closely and said that she had taken up too much of his time and therefore wished him success in his studies. Tollyman Elliot looked at the young gentleman with a smile and said that it seemed to happen that he was late. The young gentleman, in turn, asked for forgiveness. The Count smiled and said that everything was fine and they could just finish their classes later. Tollyman Elliot looked at the young gentleman with alarm and asked if something had happened, as his face was gloomy. Rehan was puzzled, as he assumed that the Duchess wanted him to run away from home, and so she said that she would help him if he had such a desire. He looked closely at his teacher and asked how much money it took to spend a day away from home. The Count smiled and asked the young man if he was interested in traveling. He said that it usually cost him about 10 copper coins. The Count smiled and said that he knew a great place where you could get a beautiful bronze tan. Rehan sighed, looking at his pocket money. He understood that he would do everything possible to make it work. Sometime later, the Duchess returned to her husband with a joyful smile. He looked at her in surprise and asked if something good had happened. She said with a smile that she had become friends with the young master. The Grand Duchess knew that this was a huge success, because when he wanted to escape, he would come to her. Edith sighed heavily and said that he did not understand it. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily, and looking at his wife, asked why she was trying so hard to improve her relationship with this young gentleman. She sighed heavily and said that he had already written off Gilbert, but she still didn't want to quarrel with the younger gentleman as well. He looked at her with bewilderment and said that they were brothers, and even if she was kind to him, he could still betray her, since a young man could not hate his older brother no matter what he did. Edith sighed heavily and said that Rehan was not an ordinary boy at all. Maevia understood perfectly well that even if she hadn't finished reading the original, it was clear to her that the boy wouldn't be able to let his older brother go just like that, so she just didn't want the boy to get hurt. Maevia looked at her husband closely and said that she would definitely remember his advice, but she knew that the young master was dear, and the young boy. She looked at her husband closely and said that he was also his family. The Duke looked at his wife and began to talk about the boy. But a moment later, his face changed, and he didn't say anything to her. She sighed heavily, because she understood that he was full of secrets. She smiled and asked her husband if he was afraid that she might get hurt. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that he had already told her earlier that she thought too highly of him. She smiled and said that her husband was just a wonderful man, and even if he betrayed her, she was sure that he would be able to comfort her. She smiled looking at her husband and said that he would stroke her head and let her rest her head on his lap. He froze for a moment in surprise. She smiled and said that it seemed she had said too much, and she should not interfere in such things. But still, she said that it didn't matter, and he should continue to take care of her, Mavia asked with a smile. If that wasn't too presumptuous of her. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that she had won, and he would take care of her. She smiled and thanked him for giving in to her. It had already been a week since she started spending the night with her husband in the same room. Several times she hugged him in her sleep. For this, she was transferred back to her own room. She was in shock since she was a wife who was kicked out just because she hugged her husband in her sleep. Sarah, with tears in her eyes and surprise, asked the lady if she was okay. Mavia only smiled and said that they had a very good relationship. After such an eviction, she slept a little and began a full new day. In the morning, she had breakfast with a young man, and several times during the day, she accidentally ran into him in the corridor. And in the evening, she wished him good night. Every day, she tried to get closer to the young gentleman, but for some reason, it seemed to her that he had recently started avoiding her. She wondered if it was just her imagination, or if it was all real. Sometime later, she became an unwitting witness to a conversation between young people. The knight looked closely at the young gentleman and asked if something had happened, as he looked very depressed. He sighed heavily and asked if Mr. Gilbert had offended him again. Rayhan was taken aback and said that it was not so. Rayhan looked closely at the knight and asked if he was close to the Duchess. She was surprised, as she did not expect the conversation to suddenly turn to her. Rayhan sighed heavily and said that the Duchess was very kind to him and very gentle. The young gentleman did not finish speaking when suddenly the butler came silently and said that he had classes and it was time for him to go. Rayhan asked for forgiveness and said that he was going right now. The young lady was furious, and she did not understand why the butler came at such a crucial moment. At this time, the young knight thought for a moment, since he did not know what had happened between the young master and the Duchess. At the same time, the Duchess quietly crept up to the young knight and said in a puzzled tone that she herself was interested in what had happened. Procyon cried out because he did not expect to see the Duchess at all. She looked closely at the bunk and the king and asked if he could give her a little of his time. Mavia looked closely at the knight and said that the young master seemed to feel very at ease with him. She asked, puzzled, what the secret was. He was taken aback and said that in fact, there were no special reasons. She looked at him intently and said that he should think again and very carefully, because there was probably something. He smiled and said that now that he thought about it, he remembered that after he defeated his sparring partner with one punch, they became closer. She was taken aback and wondered if she could defeat him with one blow, everything would work out. The young man was in shock, as he was not yet ready to part with his life. Procyon looked closely at the Duchess and asked if there was something going on in their relationship. She sighed heavily and said that she thought the young master was favorably disposed towards her, but apparently this was not so. He sighed heavily and said that even he could see that this was not so. She looked at him intently and asked if he really wanted to fight with her. He shouted that he couldn't do it and also asked her to give him a chance because he wanted to figure out what was wrong with the young master. Mavia asked with a smile if she could rely on him. Then he smiled and said that of course he would do everything and find out everything, only he begged her to cancel their sparring. She smiled and wished him luck. Sometime later, he returned to her again with a joyful smile. The Duchess looked at him intently and asked if he had done the task properly. He smiled and said that of course he had done everything properly. She looked at him impatiently and asked what the reason was. She sighed heavily and asked if he had explained well that this would not happen. He smiled and said that he had not said anything. He just thought that this was possible and could really happen. She was shocked and asked him to say everything properly. The knight looked closely at the lady and said that earlier, the maid had told him that the master had asked her for pocket money. She was surprised and looked at him, but at that very moment, he said that this was the first time Teresa had been surprised. Mavia said with a smile that if he was afraid of her, because she could crumple his brother like a piece of paper, then she already had a solution. He looked at her in surprise and asked what solution she was talking about. The Duchess smiled predatorily and said that she simply needed to show that she couldn't do it. The young man, in turn, looked at her with bewilderment and imagined this picture. She stood quietly behind the door and waited for the young man, knowing that he would soon pass by. A moment later, she finally noticed him and prepared to act. She looked at the young man intently, as she found it funny to even think that with that sweet face, he was worried that she might crush his brother. But she knew it was okay, because she had a damn simple solution. She knew she just needed to show that she wasn't that strong a moment later. Mavia pretended to feel dizzy and fall. Mavia said with all her might that if someone didn't catch her, she might just fall to the ground. The young man ran towards her in a hurry and shouted that he would catch her. A moment later, the young gentleman managed to catch the Grand Duchess. She looked at him intently and with a tender smile thanked him for catching her. But looking back, he froze in shock because he did not understand why there was no one in the corridor. No one was there since the young Duchess had foreseen everything and dismissed all the servants in advance. She looked at him intently, with her hoarse voice, told him that he didn't need to bother so much because this happened to her all the time. He looked at her in surprise, but remembered how last time she had blood pouring from her ear. With tears in her eyes, she said that she had been in poor health since birth. He was shocked, as he did not expect this. Rayhan said that she should rest a little, and then everything would pass, but he knew that her bedroom was far away. He looked at her intently and asked if she would like to rest in his room. The Duchess joyfully shouted that in that case she would feel better, much faster. Rayhan said with a gentle smile that in that case he would hold her hand and they could walk together. She thanked him with a gentle smile for his support, but he still looked at her with bewilderment and asked why she was walking alone. The young Duchess did not know what to answer and quickly pretended that she was feeling dizzy again. He looked at her with a sad look and asked if he should just carry her on his back. She smiled and said that everything was fine and he didn't need to worry so much. Mavia looked at him with a radiant smile and asked if he could just stay next to her because she thought that would be enough. He looked away from her, embarrassed, but still agreed. Sometime later, the young man smiling made the young Duchess's whole bed. She looked at him with a tender smile as she saw that his hand was tiny, but he was still taking her temperature. She didn't think he hated her at all. Mavia looked at the boy closely and asked if she had been causing him any inconvenience. He was taken aback and said that this was not so, because he himself knew that she was a very kind and bright person. She said that considering someone a good person and feeling uncomfortable with him are two different things. Mavia said with a tender smile that she would like to be closer to him, even if he could not truly consider her his mother. Mavia smiled and said that although she did not have the warmest relationship with the Elder Lord, and she understood that he did not know how Gilbert felt about her, she still asked him not to close himself off from her, at least for the sake of the Duke who chose her as his wife. She hoped that he would not run away from home and awaken magical creatures. She did not want him to blame himself, thinking that all this happened because of his fault. She just wanted him to remain as kind and live peacefully without troubles, as long as she was by his side. She wanted to help him until the very end. Mavia watched him go with a smile, because she knew that the big problem was that he was too kind. She knew that she had to leave quietly because she didn't want to cause him any trouble, but she knew that he might be late for class because of her, and therefore wanted to pack his things for the lesson. So the Duchess slowly approached the table as she wanted to find out what his next subject was. She wanted to take the schedule that Mrs. Teresa gave her, but a moment later, she froze in place in surprise. She was shocked when she opened the small book that the young gentleman had been using to keep records, and saw that he had been collecting things that he wanted to take with him when he ran away from home. After the young man returned to her with medicine, she, with a slight fever, was ordered to rest. She wanted to say that she did not mean at all that he should run away from home, but she understood that this would be the same as admitting that she had read his notebook. Mavia was in shock, not understanding how things had gone wrong, and wondering why he had misunderstood her words. She was furious because she understood that everything that happened was Gilbert's fault, since he had severely trampled on the very assessment of his younger brother. Although she supposed that it might have been her fault, she was furious, because she realized that she simply lacked the skills to talk to children. Sometime later, she came to her husband, and sighing heavily, said that this time she had lost. She admitted that it was very difficult to become friends with the young master, and that it would take her a long time. She was puzzled, because she understood that she needed a lot of time, but the Duke said that there are no perfect people. He sighed heavily and asked what it mattered, that she had difficulty getting along with children. She sighed heavily and thanked him for the consolation that did not console her at all. Mavia said that since he had consoled her, he should do it again, and she leaned on him. He looked at her with bewilderment, and at the same moment she asked with a smile if he really wanted her to sit on his lap. Edith sighed heavily and said that he didn't want that. At the same time, she was next to him and kept thinking about his beautiful and resilient body. With the speed of lightning, she distanced herself from her husband because she knew that now she needed to think about the young master. She had already realized that abrupt approaches backfired, so she wanted to act gradually, but she wondered what if he ran away before they got closer. But if he stayed, then the monster was in the forest, like in the original story, and then he would feel guilty. A moment later, she told her husband, with a satisfied smile, that she really was a genius. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really understood anything. She smiled and said that she had realized a very important thing, because if she couldn't solve a problem with her mind, she had to solve everything with her fists. The Duke was taken aback and looked at her in bewilderment, since he hadn't expected anything like that at all. Edith looked at his wife with bewilderment and asked where the thinking of a genius was. She smiled and said that geniuses come in different forms. The Duchess knew the problem was how to find an excuse to go hunting for the monster. She looked closely at her husband and understood that everything could be circumvented if she loved him enough to want to open up to him. A moment later, the butler came in and said that the Count had asked me to tell his lordship that he had a report. And he also said something about the account books, the land management report, and the list of complaints filed. The butler asked if he should tell the Count to wait a little. The Duchess firmly said that this was not worth doing, as it was not at all proper to keep you waiting for the bacon. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise, as he had not expected such a thing, but she said that he could ignore her words. She looked at the butler with a smile and told him to immediately escort the Count to her office, or rather, to respectfully escort him. She knew that if everything went well, the matter would be resolved easily. The Count greeted the Duchess with tears in his eyes and said that he was literally counting the days until she would honor him. She interrupted him and said that he should get straight to the point and be brief. He said that he only wanted to express how much she meant to them all. The Duchess smiled and said that she was very glad to see him, but that she was much more interested in the contents of the documents than in his thoughts about her. A moment later, the young Duchess looked at the documents in bewilderment. She looked at him in surprise, because he had brought her a denunciation of the director of the orphanage who fed 30 children with 1 chicken. She looked closely at the Count, and since the report was clearly full of child abuse and poor parenting on the part of the higher-ups, she wondered if he was really competent. A few seconds later, the Duchess found what she was looking for, as there was a denunciation that mysterious bloody footprints had appeared in the forest, the work of demons or humans. It was unknown, and they were begged for the sake of their well-being to catch the criminal as quickly as possible. Manhwa turned, and looking at her husband, asked if he remembered that she had asked him to accompany her on an inspection of the property. He thought for a moment, and said that he remembered about it, but looking out the window, he asked if she was sure that she could go out. She was taken aback, since due to the spells, she did not know at all about the weather outside. She, irritated, asked if there was usually so much snow at this time of year. The Count said that it was not a matter of the time of year when the gentleman was absent. The weather was quite good. She looked at the Count in surprise, as she did not understand what the weather had to do with it. At the same time, Edith looked menacingly at the Count and told him to get down to business and briefly outline everything. The Count was very frightened and rushed to the exit in a hurry, but he still shouted to the Duchess that he had told her everything he wanted. She froze for a moment with a look of bewilderment on her face. She was shocked because she understood that if the Count's words were true, then she would live in the cold for the rest of her life. She could not even imagine that being the wife of the Northern Duke was so difficult. He looked at her intently and said that he would find a way, and also asked if she could wait a little. He smiled and said that in return, hair care security, everything will be his concern. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she agreed. Manhwa looked at her husband with tenderness, as she saw that he was handsome with the perfect body of the absolute ruler of this world. He looked at her with his gentle smile and asked her to understand him. Manhwa looked at him with a tender smile and said that since she was a kind-hearted wife, she would of course understand and support him, but she still hoped that he would definitely keep his promise. The next day, the snow finally stopped. She had the feeling that her husband had simply gone and threatened the sky. She knew that, of course, a person could not do something like that, but she was not sure that her husband was not capable of it, since she knew that he was not an ordinary person at all. The butler looked closely at the Duchess and asked if she had any suspicions about the culprit. She looked at him in surprise. The Duke said that he had been informed of strange sounds in the first bell tower. Manhwa was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, as she had been distracted for a short time. The butler said that according to the servants, it sounded like the whining of a small breed of animal. Perhaps it was a wolf or another wild animal, but he was going to check everything himself. Manhwa looked at her husband closely and asked if he wanted to go and see for himself. He was surprised, but she said that she just needed a little time to get used to the cold before exploring the property, and since the snow had already stopped, there was just the right excuse to go out. Manhwa gave her husband a dazzling smile and asked if he would go with her because he had promised her security support and hair care. The Duke smiled and said that even without promises, he would do it, since with such a look as hers, it was impossible to refuse. She was glad since she knew that this was the success of feminine charms. He looked at her intently, as if he knew that, but she reminded him of that. A few hours ago, the young lady was sighing heavily as she realized that the sleigh was a bad idea because it was very cold outside. She was in shock. She didn't understand how people could be like this. She didn't understand who would go sledding in such weather. The Duke asked his wife with a smile if she couldn't see how the boy was already covered in sweat. She was in shock, wondering if she would ever be able to beat the cold. He sighed heavily and said that it sounded more difficult than making friends with their children. A moment later, The Duke looked at his wife with his gentle smile and handed her a small ball. She looked at it in surprise, as it was slightly larger than the one he had given her at the tower. Edith said tenderly that it was still not enough for her to lie naked in the snow, so she had better not take off her clothes. She smiled and said that she thought he was speaking seriously. After a short conversation, she looked closely at her husband, as she understood that he was a caring person, but sometimes he set boundaries. She wondered if this was just his nature. A moment later, the young people were taken aback as they heard some kind of scream and noise. The Duchess threw the ball out with lightning speed and ran towards the young gentleman. At the same time, Procyon hugged the young gentleman tightly and told him to hold on tight. With ease and grace, they jumped up, and the sleigh fell. The Duchess was in shock. She shouted to her husband that they must save them, but the Duke calmly said that they would be fine. She was in shock and very worried about them, but a moment later, she clearly saw the knight in front of her along with his young master. The Duke sighed heavily and said that since their faithful knight was with the young master, it meant that everything was under control. She sighed heavily as she remembered that they were together, but a moment later, the Duchess still asked what had happened since something like this was very serious. Procyon sighed heavily and said with puzzlement that something had happened to his Pegasus during the descent. She looked at her in surprise and asked if this was the name of his sleigh. He said that it was not just a sleigh, and this despite the fact that the gentleman from the magic tower himself had even cast a spell on them. Rayhan, looking at the Duke, he said that there really was something there, something like a rabbit or another small animal. He was puzzled because he did not know what to do, but the Duchess smiled and said that they should rest a little while. She and the Duke would look around. She looked closely at the knight and asked him to take care of the young master, as the symptoms may appear a little later, and at the same time, he must be vigilant and attentive. The knight said with a smile that he would do everything. She turned around, and looking at her husband, said that they were right, and there really was something small there. She came closer to him and asked in surprise that he had left. Navia was puzzled, because she didn't understand why he suddenly froze. She looked at her husband in bewilderment and asked what he had just stepped on. Long ago, about 500 years ago, he was a king of spirits who lived in a dark forest. As a king of spirits, he banished people, animals, and monsters outside the forest, but sometimes used them for his own amusement. Especially people who came to him with requests and pleas most often became his toys. He showed them the tax-squeaking and monsters, promising that there was gold and jewels there. Foolish people climbed into the jaws of monsters themselves. He drove countless people into a deadly trap. This was his fun. Kalakis appeared before him, the one he saw as only a toy, and that day he chained him. Unfortunately, he had to live in a miserable stone prison. Unlike the spirits who were imprisoned with him, he found himself in the most fragile and cramped vessel, and in order not to crumble to dust, he was forced to cling to life like a cornered animal. At first, he thirsted for revenge, then unsuccessfully denied reality. And when his patience ran out, he tried to escape. She exuded not the sickening sinister scent that was common to humans, but a sweet alluring scent, so much so that he almost wondered if it was him. But as soon as she opened her mouth, he immediately changed his mind. After all, she said that if he fulfilled her wish, she would take care of his well-being and even restore his statue. And even if he disappeared, she would still remember him. He was furious and wondered if it had been a good deal. Then he swore that if he broke free, he would take revenge on all the people who despised him, especially that girl, because he wanted to make her feel real horror while she was still alive. From that day on, he rolled on without stopping. Until she finished, he did not escape from the dark tower and set off on the trail of that strange girl who came to ask him for a wish. He was in shock, because if he had known then what he knew now, he would have quietly avoided it. He was puzzled because he understood that if the man who was next to her had not understood him, everything would have worked out. He was shocked, wondering if it was a demon in front of him, but he still threw this thought away as he saw that it was the Lord of Darkness himself in front of him. His aura was so dim that he mistook him for an ordinary person. He wondered if the man had deliberately hidden his presence. Now that he thought about it, he looked exactly the same as the first Duke. Navia was taken aback and looked in surprise at what her husband had stepped on. She was shocked because she realized that in front of her was a statue from the tower. He turned around as he realized that she recognized him. He understood that he was not destined to die after all. The Duke looked angrily at the dragon and told him to calm down. She looked at him in surprise, and with tears in her eyes asked if he had really said this to her. The Duke sighed heavily and told his wife that he had not been addressing her. A moment later, he said that he would explain everything to her right now, right to the end. She smiled and asked if she had really made a wish to the Spirit King himself. The Duke said that he looked more like a street hooligan than a king, since he was a petty tyrant who amused himself with stupid pranks. She said in surprise that many years had passed, and he remembered everything in the smallest details. She did not understand why he did not leave her then at the tower. Edith sighed heavily and said that he had actually already forgotten about everything. But as soon as he heard the dragon, he remembered everything. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand how he got to them. The Duke said that there was a crack in the seal. He put his power there and slowly crawled down. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that the dragon had been alone for a long time, and now he had met a human, and it seemed that he had become involuntarily attached to her. The Duchess looked closely at the small statue because she understood that he had some abilities, and his original form was different, but she knew that he was stupid and terribly talkative, but still he felt sympathy for the country for her. She smiled and said that they could take him with them to the castle. After all, he was a precious spirit who granted wishes, and if they left him, he would not really die. The Duke said that in such confinement, he would hardly be able to fulfill the wish. She ran around him with a joyful smile and asked if they would take him. The Duke sighed heavily and agreed with her. She smiled at him and thanked him. Looking at her husband, she asked if he could glue it together with his magic, but the Duke said that it was not even worth wasting glue on. Edith told his wife that if he were not by her side, the Spirit King could suck the life out of her. She looked at him in surprise and said that he himself had previously reported that the king had sympathy for her. The Duke said that it was his nature to deceive people, and he could not be trusted so easily. She smiled and asked if he really trusted the king to any extent, since the spirit had decided to take him into the castle. She said that if there had been even the slightest risk that he would cause harm, then her husband would have dealt with him long ago. Maevia looked at her husband with a smile and said that even if it turned out to be a lie, he could still protect her. The Duke said that the king said that she had a pleasant aroma, so he did not want to harm her. Moments later, the Duke said that since his wife wished it, they would take him to the castle in a few seconds, and he used his magic. The Duke said that the dragon was unlikely to come to his senses right away, but when he woke up, it should remind him of his wish. She asked in surprise how he could fulfill the wish while he was sealed. The Duke said that he could free him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he would really do it. He smiled and said that if she wanted it, he would do it. Edith looked at the dragon with a fierce grin and said that after the wish was fulfilled, he would take care of it. She was taken aback and asked what would happen if while dying, he turned the wish into a curse. He sighed heavily and said that he was joking, but only half joking. She looked at him puzzled, as she realized that he was serious after all. At the same time, the Spirit King was screaming and begging for salvation. She looked closely at the Spirit King as she wanted to protect him, but she intended to do so as soon as he fulfilled her wish. After some time, the young lady sighed heavily and opened her eyes. She muttered quietly that she wanted to drink some water. She was surprised she didn't understand why she woke up so early, although it seemed to her that most likely it was because she was worried about the statue. A moment later, the Duke brought his wife a glass of water. She smiled and thanked him, and also said that she was very glad that she now had a husband. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she woke up so early. Maevia said with a satisfied smile that she wanted to see his handsome face again. He sighed heavily and looked at her intently, but a moment later, in all seriousness, she asked where it hurt. Maevia looked away from her husband and said that she probably just didn't get enough sleep. He sighed heavily and said that she really should rest. A few seconds later, she heard the door slamming. She was furious because her wife woke up and said she wanted to look at her handsome husband, and he asked if she was sick. And besides, he left without saying anything. She knew that even though their marriage was arranged, they were still going to live their whole lives together. She was shocked because he didn't like touching and jokes. She knew that they were no longer strangers. He could play along with her. She was tired of constantly trying for them. A few minutes later, she clearly heard her husband's footsteps. He looked at her intently and asked her to get up for a while, as she had to eat something and then sleep. She asked in surprise if he had really prepared food for her. The Duke said that she was having difficulty eating now, so she could sleep first and then eat. She smiled and said that she would eat it all now because it was food that her husband had prepared. A moment later, she began to eat, and after a few minutes, she said that she felt very warm when she ate the food he prepared. Maevia asked in surprise why he had made her a stew. He said that when there is a fever, it is good to eat something warm. He said she had a fever. Maevia was surprised because she hadn't noticed it. He looked at her closely and, taking her temperature, said that she had a fever, and it was quite high. She froze from embarrassment, not from fever, as he touched her. She knew she had a fever, and it was most likely because her beautiful husband had touched her and was looking into her eyes. She didn't know the reason, but she felt good because he cared about her. A moment later, they heard some noise. The young gentleman informed the Duke's friend that he had come to see them, and a few seconds later, he looked into the room. Looking at the young people, he said that he hoped he would not disturb their rest. The Duchess smiled and said that he was not bothering them at all. He said that in that case he would come in. Rayhan looked closely at the Duchess and asked if she was very ill. She smiled and said that everything was fine. She just had a slight fever. With tears in his eyes, the boy said that he had heard from his knight that she had gone out into the street when she found out that he had been sledding, and now he was sure that she had caught a cold because of him. She was taken aback and said that she had business outside and that he had nothing to do with it. The Duke confirmed her words. After a short conversation, he informed the Duchess that in order for a man to recover quickly, a book was read to him, so he asked if he could read the book. She smiled and said that she agreed, because in that case, she would recover faster. A moment later, the Duke lifted the boy up, and he was taken aback. A few seconds later, the Duke sat the young boy down on their bed and told him that he could read a book. Looking sideways at his wife, he said that she had better lie down again. He smiled and said that she could sleep peacefully because he would not go anywhere and would be next to hers. A moment later, the young gentleman began to read. She knew she had to put all her thoughts aside and get some rest while they were near her. The Duchess was continuously ill for several days, but after some time she felt better. After her short illness, she returned to her work, but she noticed something very strange. She was in shock. She didn't understand why they all trembled so much in front of the Duke. She of course understood that he seemed frightening from the outside, because even to her, he sometimes reminded her of the Lord of Darkness. A moment later, the young lady heard a maid come to her. Sarah looked closely at her mistress and said that she had searched every corner of the castle and collected the necessary information. The Duchess said that the maid had done a great job and also asked if there was anything interesting. Sarah said that everyone without exception was glad of her arrival. She praised the young lady, as did all the servants, but the Duchess sighed heavily and asked her to wait a little. She smiled and said that overall, most people had a positive attitude towards her. But still, Sarah said that it was very strange since the reaction to the Duke was quite unpredictable. Mavia looked at the maid in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Sarah said that no one here had said anything about the Duke at all. Literally, even the address of his grace stuck in their throats. Even when they were together, literally, no one could touch the Duke. Sarah said she decided to check and asked one of the maids who brought fresh linen yesterday. She tried to push her to mention the Duke, but she, muttering quietly, said that she did not want to be killed or cursed. Mavia was shocked by what she heard. Sarah said that even the servants who had seen the Duke in person could be counted on one hand, and the maid had worked at the estate for 5 years, but saw him for the first time that day. The Duchess sighed heavily and dismissed her maid. Mavia was puzzled as she realized that she really did have a lot of work. She sighed heavily as she now understood why the Count had become the Duke's confidant. She looked at him intently and asked if he had ever cast a curse. Edith looked intently at his wife, but said nothing. Edith looked intently at his wife and said that it was easier to kill a person than to bring in sofas with a curse. He looked at her intently and said that since she asked such a question, it meant she heard what the servants were saying. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he knew about it. He nodded his answer silently to her. She knew that even if her maid found out, then everyone else knew too. She understood that this was just an exaggeration of gossip out of fear. Mavia was puzzled, as she knew she had a long way to go. He looked at her intently and asked why she was silent. She looked at him in bewilderment, still not understanding what she was supposed to say. He said that she thought, as always, to rush straight to solve the problem. The Duke asked if this meant that now everything was at least a little okay. She sighed heavily and said that it would be ideal, but she apparently had not yet reached his reckless courage. She smiled and said that her lazy husband, who usually doesn't even lift a finger, combed her hair himself, so she wanted to make him work even harder. Mavia said with a smile that restoring one's reputation is a voluntary matter. She knew that if she started doing any more things, he would collapse from exhaustion. Mavia understood that they had previously agreed to go on a tour of the lands together, and for this reason, she wanted to stop. The Duchess looked closely at her husband and asked how he had become a duke at all, since she knew that the late Duke had apparently had no heir, but his vassals would certainly not have welcomed him with open arms. He looked at her intently and interrupted her by saying that he could, without getting up from his seat, take out a person's bones and entrails. She was taken aback in a way she had not expected, and a moment later said that it seemed they had voted unanimously for his candidacy. She smiled and said that she would just in case check with him when it was. He smiled and said that it was a long time ago. Mavia understood perfectly well that if she was close to her husband, his reputation would increase. She knew she had to show everyone that he didn't bite at all. Some time later, the butler entered their room and said that he had come with a report. He said that the Duke was very busy as he was doing his wife's hair, and so he would come later. The Duke said that everything was fine and he could talk. It wasn't intentional, but for the first time, she felt guilty in front of the head butler, because even a professional at such a moment could not hide his expression, as if he was watching not a hair combing, but a beheading. After his report, he bowed and said that he would leave them. Mavia smiled and said that she had a strange feeling, as if she had offended an innocent person. The Duke said that if anyone was uncomfortable, then next time he would simply throw everyone out. She sighed heavily and said that this should not be done, and people should get used to it. She looked at her husband with a smile and asked what was strange about the fact that the husband was simply combing his wife's hair. He smiled and said that this time he didn't mind. Mavia told her husband with admiration that he simply had golden hands and asked if he was really going to take care of her hair around the clock. Edith told his wife that there was a land survey coming up soon, and he was just practicing just in case. He looked at her closely and said that she thought that if the servants saw how close they were, their attitude towards him would change. But the opposite effect was also possible. They could start to support her too. Edith smiled and said that even considering the laudatory ballads, it was unlikely that such a thing would happen from her. She was shocked, since the information spread very quickly. He smiled and said that his wife was of course quite capable of taking care of her own hair, but it was sad to leave her alone. Edith smiled and said that at times like these, he had to fill her void. She was shocked, didn't understand why he'd fallen out. He'd been so affectionate with her lately. For a moment, one might have thought that they had married for love. Some time ago, Madame said of her daughter that the Duke was hardly a kind man. She was puzzled because even for closed lands, this was too much, because the rumors about him were very cruel. She knew that the Duke himself almost never left his chambers. Madame sighed heavily and said that he could not be an absolute monster. Unfortunately, no one knew what he was really like. Was he a hero or a killer? The madam asked her daughter to be careful with him. Mavia smiled and told her mother not to worry. Until that moment, she thought she knew her husband well, although she had not finished reading the book. She knew that there were many stories about him in the book. Edith was without ambition, without greed, a recluse who never even left his bedroom. He even allegedly received the ducal title against his will from the previous duke. However, if you put aside his reclusiveness and lack of ambition, he was the perfect man, so she decided to marry him instead, paying an astronomical sum and breaking the contract that was left over from the previous generation. Mavia had a rough idea why he had accepted her offer. He probably found it amusing that someone would propose to the object of everyone's fear. Her actions seemed unusual to him, so he became interested. And besides, she knew information that was unknown to others. He probably decided to keep her close and keep an eye on her at the same time, because that was the kind of person he was. But now she was puzzled, because she didn't know why he was so kind to her. She understood that it could not be said that he was simply fulfilling his marital duty. She wondered if he really thought she was special. She was curious about what was going on in his head, as she knew his past was shrouded in mystery. He looked at her intently and called out, as he saw that she was frozen in place. Edith told his wife that she should rest. Lying in bed, she looked at him intently and asked if she could ask a question. He smiled and said that she didn't need to ask permission. Mavia asked him what exactly he liked about her that made him agree to the proposal. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she herself had not chosen him as her husband. She was shocked and asked if this was the only reason she wanted to know if no one had ever proposed to him before. She was shocked as she did not expect to hear such a thing, and silently calmed her heart. She saw that he spoke the pure truth with ease. Mavia asked with a smile if he shouldn't have friends. Edith smiled and said that as far as friends went, he only had one weird guy and one bungler. He said they were men, and even if they proposed to him, he would refuse. She thought for a moment and wondered what kind of friends he had. She wondered if he really lived in a cave. He smiled and said that perhaps one day, there would come a day when he would tell her everything about you in detail, but now was clearly not that day. She looked at his husband intently as she realized that he had no plans to tell her anything. Looking at his wife, she said that she hardly saw how he slept. He said that he slept as much as he needed, and also said that he was simply not used to sharing a bed with another, so he got used to it gradually. The Duchess said that she did not think about it at all. He also said that it had nothing to do with carnal pleasures. She smiled and said sheepishly that she hadn't thought anything like that at all, because he had said that he couldn't have children. He sighed heavily and said that this was a peculiarity of the body. Mavia said that some people had unique physiological limitations. He sighed heavily and said that it was not what she thought. And at the same time, he wished her pleasant dreams, as he was a little confused. Yes, but about the topic. She smiled and also wished him sweet dreams. The next morning, she stood frozen in shock, as it was a memorable moment. For the first time, he didn't kick her out and waited for her to wake up. Although she was worried by the lack of sleepiness on his face, she still wished him to adapt quickly and got out of bed. She looked at us with embarrassment at his husband, as things were gradually getting better between them. Mavia even thought that she would spend the night in her bedroom that evening, because he might be tired of her, but her fears turned out to be in vain, since her husband looked completely ordinary. She was glad that the information she'd been wanting for so long had finally arrived. She wanted to know about the very forest where the bloody footprints had been found. She remembered that these lands belonged to the Baron himself, who had sent her an absurd letter. Maevia looked into the distance with a satisfied grin, because she knew that since he did not want to come, she would visit him herself. She was interested in what reward to give to such a loyal vassal. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked why she was suddenly asking about these lands. She smiled and said that she simply liked them and would like to visit them.